It begins with a whisper, not the kind carried by wind or spoken by living lips, but the kind that clings to the corners of history. Quiet, persistent, impossible to erase. You hear it in the cracks between ancient buildings, in the dim corridors of forgotten palaces, in the yellowed margins of letters no one was meant to read. A whisper older than nations, older than the flags we swear to, older even than the maps that define our world. It speaks of families who did not simply witness history, but shaped it from the shadows. Imagine the world as you know it. Borders, governments, parliaments, presidents, prime ministers, kings. Now imagine that behind each of these visible structures lies an invisible hand. A lineage, a dynasty. A name you may have never heard, yet one that quietly influences your life even today. Not through public proclamations or televised speeches, but through unseen decisions, discreet alliances, and the quiet pressure of generational power. This is where our story begins. Not with a war or a coronation, not with a revolution or a throne, but with an idea. That some families have survived every empire, every regime, every political shift, because they mastered the art of being unseen. While kings sought glory and died for it, while politicians fought for the spotlight and were swallowed by it, these families discovered a different truth. Power does not need to be loud. In fact, it works best when it is silent. Picture a candlelit chamber in medieval Europe. A young duke kneels before a king, pledging allegiance. But in the shadows behind him, watching, are three older men. They wear no crowns. They hold no swords. Their names will never appear in chronicles. Yet when the king rises the next morning and signs a treaty that will redirect the future of a continent, the decision is not his own. It was shaped, gently but unmistakably, by the shadows behind him. History remembers the king, but the whisper belongs to them. As centuries unfold, the same pattern repeats itself across Europe. Monarchies rise, republics form, revolutions erupt like storms. But the whisper continues uninterrupted, slipping through the cracks of each new era. It does not care who sits on the throne. It cares only about influence, continuity, and survival. When empires fall, these families do not fall with them. They step around the rubble, adjust their strategies, and continue forward. You see their traces everywhere if you know where to look. In the way certain banking houses appear in records generation after generation, untouched by war or economic collapse. In the marriages that unite powerful lineages at precisely the moment history begins to shift. In the papal elections where the outcome seems almost preordained, as though guided by an invisible consensus formed centuries before. In the quiet donation that builds a university, the discreet investment that steers a government, the whispered advice that nudges a leader in a particular direction. And yet, despite their influence, these families remain largely absent from popular history. Students memorize the names of generals and kings, but not the discreet noble lines that financed them, counseled them, or placed them there. It is a strange paradox. The more hidden the influence, the more enduring it becomes. Now imagine yourself walking alone at night through an ancient European city. Florence, Venice, Vienna, Rome. The stones beneath your feet have seen more conspiracies, more secrets, than any textbook could ever hold. You pass beneath shuttered windows, behind which generations of the same family once convened. Their discussions were not about winning battles or seizing power by force, but about maintaining presence, influence, and continuity. They understood something fundamental. Power that is visible can be challenged. Power that is invisible can last forever. This is the heart of the mystery. The Black Nobility, not a term of evil, but a reference to the black of secrecy, the unseen corner of aristocratic history. These were not simply wealthy families. They were strategic families. They did not seek thrones. They sought the ability to influence thrones. They rarely commanded armies. They controlled the decisions that moved them. They did not crave titles. They craved continuity, the ability to outlive every generation, every system, every revolution. And they succeeded. Their story is not a story of dark magic or fantastical conspiracies. It is a story of patience, adaptation, and the relentless accumulation of advantages. The world changed around them. Empires rose, republics dawned, Ideologies clashed, but they adapted every time. Their influence became quieter, more subtle, woven deeper into institutions, marriages, and financial networks. Invisibility became their fortress. But the whisper has grown louder in recent decades. Not because the families have changed, but because the world has. We live in an age of transparency, of information, of restlessness. People question everything. Governments, corporations, institutions, the wealthy, the powerful. And when answers are not clear, the mind reaches for patterns. Sometimes real, sometimes imagined. The legend of the Black Nobility grew in that vacuum, fed by fragments of truth and shadows of speculation. Yet beneath all the exaggerations and myths, one question remains hauntingly persistent. How did certain aristocratic families manage to survive every storm of history when so many others vanished? The whisper returns. They survived because they understood the deeper rules of power. As we begin this journey into their world, the important thing is not whether every legend is true, nor whether every rumor is false. What matters is the pattern, the remarkable continuity of influence that stretches across centuries, defying the shifting tides of history. And so our story opens at the edge of that whisper, inviting you closer, past the noise of modern politics, past the myth-making of the internet, past the romantic tales of noble houses. What remains is something quieter, older, and far more intriguing. A legacy of power built not on visibility, but on silence. A network older than nations, older than the systems that rule us today. A shadow aristocracy whose story has never fully been told. Until now. Venice does not introduce itself quietly. It rises from the water like a dream that refuses to be forgotten. Stone palaces balanced on ancient wooden piles, silent canals reflecting the sky like liquid mirrors, and a maze of narrow alleys where sound behaves strangely, whispering instead of echoing. Yet for all its beauty, Venice has always been a city of masks. Not just the painted masks worn during Carnival, but the invisible ones worn by its rulers, its merchants, and its noble families. In this place, appearance was never reality. And that is precisely why the whisper of hidden power found its earliest home here. Imagine the city centuries ago. Gondolas gliding across the Grand Canal as torches flicker in the windows of palazzos. Traders from the east unloading spices, silks, and secrets at the docks. Senators in long robes disappearing into chambers where no one outside their circle knew what was discussed. To outsiders, Venice appeared as a vibrant republic, a model of stability and prosperity. But beneath this shining surface, the true engine of the city was a finely tuned machine of secrecy and silent influence. Venice was ruled by the Great Council, thousands of noblemen whose families were listed in a sacred book that decided who was worthy of power. But the key fact, something the world often forgets, is that although many had titles, only a handful truly ruled. The city was the stage, the noble houses were the performers. But the script was written by the select few who understood that influence thrives behind closed doors, not in public squares. The Doge, the elected ruler of Venice, was the face of the republic. Yet he was also the least free of all its leaders. His every move was monitored, every decision scrutinized, every public appearance rehearsed. He could not open letters without witnesses, could not leave the palace without permission, could not choose his own advisors. The city deliberately chained its ruler, ensuring that no single man could ever control Venice. So who controlled it? The families. Old, rooted, intertwined through marriages, alliances, and centuries of negotiations. They developed a way of ruling that avoided the instability of monarchies. They believed power should not be concentrated. It should be diffused subtly across bloodlines, committees, councils, and networks. Power should feel like the tide. Always present, always moving, but never fully seen. Walk with this understanding through the narrow streets of Venice, and suddenly the city transforms. Every balcony becomes a possible vantage point for private observation. Every canal becomes a pathway for messengers carrying whispered instructions. Every bridge becomes a crossing where alliances were formed or broken. Venice was not built for open rule. It was engineered for quiet navigation of influence. This is where the roots of the Black Nobility legend begin to take shape. not in dark rituals or mysterious cabals, but in the daily rituals of a city designed to hide its political machinery behind ritual, symbolism, and complexity. Venice's noble families learned to maintain power by fragmenting it, guiding it, and cloaking it in tradition so opaque that outsiders had no hope of understanding how decisions were truly made. Visitors from other lands often left Venice puzzled. They saw no king, no military strongman, no emperor. And yet the city commanded wealth greater than entire nations. It controlled trade routes that connected Europe to the east. It financed kings and armies. It negotiated with the Pope almost as an equal. How could a city so lacking in visible authority wield so much real power? The answer lay in its families. The Dorias, the Morosinis, the Corneros, the Justinianis, the Lordans. They were not just families, they were institutions unto themselves. Their palaces were more than homes. They were private courts, strategic headquarters, vaults of generational intelligence. They understood that money was not the only currency. Information, loyalty, marriage, and timing were far more potent. Picture one of their meetings late at night. A heavy wooden door closes. Candles illuminate the faces of 4 or 5 men. Maps are laid on the table. Letters sealed with broken wax lie open beside glasses of deep red wine. A decision is made, perhaps a shift in trade, perhaps a strategic marriage, perhaps a discreet message to a foreign court. Outside, the city sleeps, unaware that its future has just been nudged in a new direction. Venice thrived because these nudges were controlled, consistent, and calculated. Nothing was left to chance. And the families learned that the true advantage of invisibility was not secrecy for its own sake, but because it prevented rivals from identifying where to strike. A king could be assassinated. A throne could be toppled. But a network of families with centuries of interwoven influence, that could not be easily defeated. Over time, the world grew to respect Venice as a master of diplomacy, a spider at the center of a web whose threads reached from Constantinople to London. Yet the city's true power was never its fleets or its riches. It was its tradition of political subtlety. That tradition influenced every noble family that rose through its ranks. It shaped their worldview. It taught them that survival depended not on dominating the stage, but on directing the actors from behind the curtain. As you watch the gondolas glide gently through the canals today, it is difficult to imagine the weight of history pressed into every stone of this floating city. Tourists take photographs of ancient palaces without knowing the stories those walls would tell if they could speak. They walk through Piazza San Marco unaware that this plaza once served as a theater of controlled public perception. They admire the Doge's palace yet rarely understand that it was less a seat of power and more a symbol of carefully orchestrated restraint. Venice may look serene on the surface, but beneath that calm is a legacy of strategic thinking, political finesse, and centuries of subtle maneuvering. This is the soil in which the idea of the Black Nobility took root. Families who did not simply rule, they shaped, guided, and crafted outcomes without ever needing to appear responsible. And as Venice's influence expanded across Europe, these families carried their methods with them. Their sons married into other aristocratic houses. Their daughters became queens, duchesses, and consorts. Their wealth funded wars, diplomacy, and religious movements. Wherever they went, the Venetian philosophy of quiet influence took hold. This was the beginning of something larger, a movement of noble families who understood that the truest form of power is the one no one sees. A power that survives every regime. A power that learns to flow like water, adapting to the shape of every era. A power born in a city of masks, but destined to shape far more than Venice. To understand the rise of the shadow aristocracy, you must travel far beyond Venice, back through the centuries, past the fall of empires, past the collapse of ancient realms, into a world where the idea of Europe itself was still being shaped. The birth of this hidden nobility does not begin in a single city or under a single crown. It begins with survivors, families who learned how to bend with history rather than break beneath it. Picture the final days of the Roman Empire. Marble temples decaying in the sun. Senators once proud now whispering fears in echoing halls. Armies failing to protect borders that collapse like sand beneath invading waves. Amid the chaos, Most elites cling desperately to vanishing power. But a few families quietly prepare for what comes next. They convert wealth into land, into private alliances, into marriages with rising warlords and new kings. When Rome falls, they do not fall with it. They step aside, shed their old identities, and slip into the new world forming around them. Their bloodline becomes their shield. Their adaptability becomes their weapon. These families do not think in terms of years or decades. They think in centuries. They understand that titles can change, empires can crumble, but influence, carefully preserved and strategically passed down, can survive almost anything. This mindset becomes the foundation of what later generations will call the hidden aristocracy. As the Middle Ages dawn, Europe becomes a mosaic of duchies, kingdoms, principalities, and city-states, each with its own ambitions, conflicts, and shifting loyalties. This world is dangerous for most, but ideal for those who know how to navigate it. These early dynasties, Orsini, Colonna, Colleoni, Pallavicini, Doria, begin to weave themselves into the fabric of this fractured continent, not through conquest but through calculation. Their story is not one of swords but of marriages, not of armies but of alliances. A young noblewoman is sent to a distant court, carrying with her a dowry and a subtle directive from her family. Observe everything, say little, and choose your friendships wisely. A son is trained not only in combat but also in diplomacy, arithmetic, and the reading of coded letters. A patriarch spends his evenings in candlelight, mapping the political landscape and predicting the rise and fall of rival houses. These families are not simply surviving, they are positioning themselves like chess pieces centuries before the game is fully understood. One of their greatest advantages is memory. While kingdoms change rulers every generation, these families keep records. Private archives filled with contracts, correspondences, genealogies, and secrets. They remember who owes what. They remember who betrayed whom. They remember which alliances proved fruitful and which brought ruin. A king may reign for 40 years, but a family can reign through 500 simply by outlasting him. As Christianity spreads across Europe and the Church becomes an emerging superpower, the families adapt again. They fund monasteries, secure bishoprics for their sons, become patrons of emerging clerical elites. They understand that piety can be as useful as politics, and sometimes more powerful. The papacy becomes not merely a religious institution but a field in which these families cultivate influence with precision. They do not seek the throne of St. Peter for themselves. They seek to guide those who sit upon it. You can almost imagine a gathering in a stone hall thick with incense, a bishop seated at a long table, two noblemen standing behind him, speaking calmly but firmly. The bishop signs a decree. The noblemen leave through a side door. The document will shape policy, affect kingdoms, move armies. And yet the hands that guided the pen will never be acknowledged in public. This is the art of invisible power. Meanwhile, in the Byzantine East, great families maintain their own traditions of subtle influence. As Constantinople thrives, collapses, recovers, and eventually falls, a number of surviving noble bloodlines flee westward, carrying the legacy of ancient Rome into new lands. They marry into Italian and French houses, merging Byzantine subtlety with Western ambition. When the Crusades begin, the families seize yet another opportunity. Financing armies becomes as important as fighting in them. Lending to monarchs becomes more valuable than serving them. A king desperate for funds to launch a campaign may find himself indebted not to a rival kingdom, but to a quiet noble house with no army, just a meticulous ledger and a keen understanding of political leverage. And with every loan, influence grows. By the time the Renaissance dawns, Europe is entering a new age. Art flourishes, trade expands, cities grow, and beneath all this visible progress, the hidden aristocracy deepens its roots. They are no longer merely noble families. They are nodes in an ever-expanding network of merchants, bankers, diplomats, clergy, and landholders. They move between courts with ease. They speak multiple languages. They hold land in one kingdom, estates in another, partnerships in a third. Their greatest strength is their detachment from nationalism. They do not belong to France or Italy or Spain or the Holy Roman Empire. They belong to themselves, to their lineage, their alliances, their vision of continuity. Nations rise and fall around them, but their network remains intact. Some contemporaries begin to notice. Chroniclers write in coded terms about certain families who appear favored by fortune. Ambassadors complain that treaties are being shaped by influences unseen. A few kings grow uneasy, sensing that their own decisions may not entirely be their own. Yet nothing can be proven. Nothing is ever obvious. Influence never leaves fingerprints. What makes these families extraordinary is not supernatural power or mythic conspiracy. It is discipline, patience, the ability to endure while others crumble, the refusal to cling to a single structure of power. When feudalism begins to decline, they invest in commerce. When commerce evolves into banking, they master financial instruments. When the church's political influence wanes, they shift toward statecraft and diplomacy. Century after century, they evolve. By the late Renaissance, they are fully formed, an aristocracy not of visible crowns but of invisible continuity. They have survived Rome, the Dark Ages, the Crusades, plagues, invasions, and civil wars. And through each era, they grew stronger, quieter, and more tightly interwoven. Their origins are not mysterious. They are simply ancient. Their methods are not magical. They are logical, calculated, and ruthlessly effective. And the world they helped shape continues to echo their influence. For these families, power is not an event. It is a lineage, a shadow passed from generation to generation, uninterrupted by the rise and fall of empires. The name did not begin as a symbol of fear. It did not emerge from secret rites or forbidden gatherings. It was whispered quietly in the corridors of European politics, spoken first by those who noticed something unusual, families whose power did not rise and fall with the tides of kingship, but instead persisted, unchanged, untouched, as though wrapped in a cloak darker than history itself. They called them the Black Nobility. Not black as in sinister, black as in hidden, black as in the ink of documents never meant for public eyes, black as in the shadow behind the throne. In an age when power was measured by how loudly it announced itself, trumpets, banners, royal proclamations, these families moved in the opposite direction. Their power grew quieter as it grew greater. While some dynasties flaunted their dominance, building golden palaces and commissioning extravagant portraits, the Black Nobility families learned a different lesson. The brightest flame attracts the quickest attack. Better to be the unseen candle in a dark room than the blazing torch that draws every challenger. Their name first gained traction in Italy, where politics was a labyrinth and survival required far more than brute strength. As the papal states expanded and contracted like a living organism, noble houses aligned themselves carefully. The Orsini, the Colonna, the Borghese, the Chigi, these families navigated the shifting alliances with uncanny precision. Whenever a pope fell out of favor, another rose, often from within their own social orbit. Whenever factions clashed violently in the streets, these families retreated to private chambers, negotiating outcomes long before the public even realized what was happening. The term Black Nobility was used by observers who noticed that certain decisions, appointments, treaties, marriages, seemed to occur with no clear origin. Laws shifted, alliances changed, fortunes rose or fell. Yet the individuals responsible were never the ones in front of the crowd. Sometimes it seemed that the most powerful offices in Europe were merely ceremonial stages, the true commands issued by hands far more discreet. As the papacy became the center of continental politics, influence over the church became the ultimate prize. Yet the Black Nobility did not seek the papal throne for themselves, not directly. They understood that ruling openly came with burdens they did not need. Instead, they positioned sons as cardinals, advisors, financiers. They built networks of influence that stretched into monasteries, universities, and administrative offices. They learned to guide the church without appearing to control it. Imagine a papal election inside the Sistine Chapel. The cardinals debate, pray, and vote under Michelangelo's frescoes. But outside the sacred chamber, in the courtyards and palazzos of Rome, agreements have already been quietly prepared. Letters exchanged. Promises made. A certain cardinal rises as a favorite, not because of divine inspiration, but because the most enduring families aligned their support behind him long before the conclave began. When white smoke appears above the chapel, the world sees God's will. The families see a carefully orchestrated result. This skill, shaping outcomes without leaving a trace, became their hallmark. As Italy fractured into competing states, as France and Spain fought for dominance, as German principalities clashed, the Black Nobility adapted with fluid grace. They funded wars without raising armies. They influenced treaties without signing them. They advised kings without being sworn into their councils. They worked behind every visible structure, turning politics into a tapestry of hidden threads only they understood. Their wealth grew not from land alone, but from banking, one of the earliest invisible empires. When popes needed loans, when kings needed armies, when merchants needed credit to risk voyages across dangerous seas, it was these families who stepped forward quietly. They did not lend as merchants. They lent as strategists. Every coin placed in the hands of a ruler was a seed planted for future influence. Whispers began to spread about their methods. How they could call in old debts at precisely the right moment to sway a decision. How they could arrange marriages that bound their rivals to them. How they never seemed surprised by political upheavals. Some said they possessed supernatural foresight. In truth, they had something far more powerful: information. They maintained networks of messengers, clerks, and informants across Europe long before modern states developed intelligence systems. A letter intercepted here, a rumor overheard there. These fragments allowed them to predict political storms before anyone else felt the wind shift. Their ability to survive became almost mythic. When revolutions toppled princes, they simply stepped aside and re-emerged in the new order. When tyrants seized power, they became advisors. When republics rose, they became financiers. The name Black Nobility became a way for the public to make sense of this uncanny resilience. People needed a term for families who seemed immune to the chaos destroying everyone else. But the name also carried something deeper, a recognition that their power did not depend on public approval. Most rulers needed the loyalty of subjects, the backing of armies, the support of the nobility. But these families operated outside that framework. Their influence came from centuries of accumulated advantage, woven so deeply into the fabric of society that removing them would unravel everything else. Some feared them, some admired them, some dismissed them as myth, but all agreed on one thing: these families existed in a world most people would never see. And that world was dark not because it was evil, but because it was hidden. Like the deep chambers beneath palaces, the locked archives beneath cathedrals, the private agreements forged in candlelight. As centuries passed, the term Black Nobility expanded beyond Italy. It became shorthand for an entire class of elite families in Europe whose influence was vast yet difficult to trace. The name was a symbol of continuity, of a shadow lineage stretching back to the ruins of Rome and forward into modernity. And the name stuck because it captured a simple truth. Some power is meant to be seen, and some power is meant to be felt. The Black Nobility belonged to the latter. When history speaks of noble families, it tends to speak loudly. Kings crowned before roaring crowds, queens draped in jewels, dynasties celebrated in paintings and paraded in triumphs. But the families who truly shaped Europe did not need such spectacle. Their influence was quieter, older, and far more enduring. These were the houses that outlasted time. Names woven into the tapestry of history like threads no fire could burn, no storm could tear, no revolution could erase. To understand them, imagine Europe not as a continent but as a stage where entire nations are characters. Some enter dramatically, some exit tragically. But a chosen few remain throughout the entire performance, shifting roles, rewriting lines, adapting to every change in lighting. These families became the unseen directors of this ancient play. Begin with the Orsini. Their story stretches back to the Middle Ages, a lineage of cardinals, generals, dukes, and political masterminds. Their palaces overlooked Rome, not simply as residences but as symbols of continuity. They survived wars, papal struggles, invasions, and internal rivalries by mastering the art of strategic retreat and timely advance. Whenever conflict threatened their house, they shifted alliances with graceful precision. Never too early, never too late. They did not cling to sides. They clung to survival. Their rivals, the Kalana, were equally formidable. While some families rose for a generation and then collapsed under the weight of fortune, the Kalana line persisted across nearly 1,000 years of upheaval. They placed their sons in crucial church positions, their daughters in marriages that carried their influence across borders. Through each turbulence, famines, plagues, military defeats, they emerged with their power largely intact. Chroniclers often marveled at their ability to rebound from ruin as if guided by some invisible hand of destiny. The Borghese were another pillar. Rising during the Renaissance, they quickly learned the mechanisms of wealth and subtle authority. Their fortunes soared when one of their own became Pope Paul V. Yet even after his reign ended, their influence remained. They had already embedded themselves into the cultural, financial, and political structures of Rome. Their palace became a monument not only to beauty but to the stability that only centuries of foresight can build. Then there were the Medicis, perhaps the most famous yet still misunderstood. To the world, they were patrons of art, supporters of Michelangelo and Galileo, founders of banks that reshaped Europe. But beneath this glamour lay a deeper truth. Their power was built on an intricate network of alliances, debts, marriages, and calculated risks. They mastered the delicate balance between visibility and secrecy. The world saw their grandeur. It rarely saw the quiet strategies behind it. And yet, even these renowned names are only a fraction of the families who carried influence across generations. Consider the Doria of Genoa, maritime titans whose ships ruled the Mediterranean. Their admirals shaped naval battles that determined the fate of empires. Their bankers financed kingdoms and negotiated treaties that influenced borders. Or the Pallavicini of Lombardy, whose reach extended across northern Italy through land, wealth, and meticulously cultivated alliances. As centuries unfolded, these families intertwined. Marriages became bridges between houses, creating a network far stronger than any one dynasty alone. A daughter of one line would become the wife of a rival house's heir, not to end conflict, but to bind influence. A son would enter the clergy, not out of piety, but because the church was a fortress of strategic opportunity. Each generation strengthened the web, layering loyalty upon loyalty, obligation upon obligation. Picture a grand wedding in Renaissance Italy. Music echoes across a candlelit courtyard. Nobles gather in their finest attire, exchanging pleasantries that mask calculations. Behind the smiles, centuries of strategy are being reaffirmed. The bride is not merely uniting with her groom. She is merging two legacies, two histories, two reservoirs of power. Such events were not only celebrations. They were agreements sealed in silk and gold. But these families were more than alliances, they were rivalries as well. The Orsini and Colonna feud, for instance, spanned centuries. Their clashes influenced papal elections, military campaigns, and local governance. Their rivalry was not petty but political, not emotional but strategic. Each victory or setback shaped the balance of power in Rome. And yet, despite the ferocity of these conflicts, both families endured. Because both understood the same fundamental truth. Influence was the ultimate inheritance. Even as monarchies shifted, empires rose and fell, and revolutions swept across Europe, these families adapted. They were not statues. They were rivers, able to bend and reroute without losing their flow. When the age of feudal knights faded, they turned to trade. When trade was overshadowed by commerce, they turned to banking. When the church's power fluctuated, they strengthened their positions in secular politics. They built palaces, investments, cultural institutions, and bonds that lasted beyond any single era. The endurance of these families puzzled many observers. How could they survive when so many others vanished into the oblivion of history? How did they secure their futures when kingdoms around them crumbled like sandcastles? The answer lay not in wealth alone, nor in luck, nor in ruthless ambition. It lay in their ability to see beyond their own generation. Where other nobles sought glory in the moment, these families planned for centuries. They refused to rely on a single source of strength. Instead, they diversified influence as modern investors diversify assets. A portion of their lineage entered the church. Another entered statecraft. Another managed financial operations. Another handled diplomacy. Failure in one sphere did not doom the family. Another branch remained strong enough to weather the loss. Their archives tell stories of strategy that span lifetimes. Letters from ancestors advising descendants on court politics long after the writers had died. Marriage contracts crafted with more precision than military treaties. Financial records that mapped the rise and fall of fortunes across Europe. These documents were not simply records. They were blueprints for survival. And always, behind each generation, stood the accumulated wisdom of those who came before. Fathers taught sons the art of negotiation. Mothers taught daughters the subtleties of social influence. Grandparents told stories not for entertainment but for instruction. Knowledge flowed down their bloodlines like an inheritance more precious than gold. As Europe modernized, these families did not cling nostalgically to their past. They transformed. Some entered politics openly, becoming senators, ministers, advisors to newly formed governments. Others moved into the world of commerce and banking, building financial empires that rivaled the power their ancestors once held through land. Still others stepped into cultural roles, patrons of universities, museums, and foundations, ensuring their names would remain associated with refinement and intellectual prestige. Their continuity became almost eerie. In cities like Rome, Venice, Genoa, and Florence, one could trace the same surnames from medieval manuscripts to modern newspapers. It was as if these families existed outside of time, immune to the forces that reduced other dynasties to footnotes. This remarkably unbroken presence is what fuels both admiration and suspicion. Admirers see them as pillars of heritage, guardians of culture, the living memory of Europe. Critics wonder whether such longevity is possible without hidden mechanisms. Agreements, networks, strategies invisible to the average eye. Whatever the truth, one fact cannot be denied. These families shaped history not with sudden bursts of power, but with the slow, steady pressure of centuries. They survived where others fell. They adapted where others resisted. They endured where others vanished. They are the thread connecting Rome's ancient past to Europe's modern present. And the deeper we follow this thread, the more it reveals a story not of luck, but of legacy. Carefully built, fiercely protected, and quietly triumphant. The papal throne has always been presented to the world as the pinnacle of spiritual authority, a seat touched by divine light, placed at the heart of Christendom. Yet behind the glow of sanctity, behind the white robes and the ringing of cathedral bells, there was another truth. No throne in Europe attracted more ambition, more strategy, more calculation than the throne of St. Peter. And no families understood this better than those who learned to wrap the papacy in velvet chains. Chains so soft they were invisible, yet strong enough to guide decisions that shaped continents. Imagine Rome in the centuries when the Church stood not only as a spiritual force but as a political giant. The papal states stretched across the Italian peninsula like a patchwork cloak. Taxes, armies, treaties, land rights, banking privileges, all passed through Vatican hands. The Pope was not simply the religious leader of millions. He was a king, a ruler, a player in the deadliest political games of Europe. And where there is power, there are those who learn to influence it. The noble families who later came to be associated with the Black Nobility understood something that many of their rivals missed. The papacy was not just a seat. It was a system, a labyrinth of cardinals, bishops, secretaries, bankers, advisors, emissaries, and factions. Controlling the Pope directly was risky, unstable, and often impossible. But controlling the environment around him, that was achievable. That was strategic. That was enduring. Picture a young cardinal walking through the halls of the Apostolic Palace. He was elected not for his holiness but for the intricate network of connections behind him. Perhaps his uncle was a senator, his cousin a banker. His family had financed churches, negotiated with monarchs, supported factions during turbulent times. His appointment was not an isolated event. It was the outcome of calculations made long before he ever donned cardinal red. Now imagine dozens of such cardinals, each backed by powerful families. Their loyalties were rarely theological. They were political, economic, and dynastic. When a papal election approached, Rome transformed into a chessboard. Ambassadors arrived from across Europe. Gold flowed silently through private residences. Promises were exchanged, alliances reformed, and rivalries reignited. And while the world waited for heavenly inspiration to guide the selection of a pope, the families behind the scenes shaped the outcome with human precision. When the cardinals locked themselves inside the Sistine Chapel for the conclave, it was a ritual filled with symbolism, doors sealed, bells waiting to ring, prayers echoing off ancient walls. But the true decisions had already been made in palazzos where chandeliers flickered over whispered negotiations. The conclave was the stage performance. The script had been written earlier. Once a pope was chosen, the families did not relax. Their influence was not a triumph to be celebrated. It was a responsibility to be maintained. The pope was often an elderly man, chosen because he was predictable or because he had promised neutrality. Yet even a neutral pope required guidance. So he was surrounded with advisors, the Camerlengo, the Secretary of State, the major penitentiaries, many of whom belonged to or were loyal to powerful families. These positions were not ceremonial. They controlled finances, diplomacy, legal affairs, and the management of the Vatican's vast estates. A pope could issue decrees, but the machinery that executed them was often guided by the hands of those who had been in place long before his election. This is what historians refer to when they speak of velvet chains. The pope walked freely, but the path beneath his feet was quietly shaped. No orders were forced upon him. No threats were made. Instead, influence flowed like warm wine, discreet, slow, yet absolutely intoxicating. Consider a papal edict favoring a particular region. To the public, it seemed an act of spiritual concern. To those who understood the game, it was a reward to a family whose financial support had tipped the balance during the conclave. Consider a cardinal suddenly elevated to a powerful administrative post. Again, to the public, it was a matter of merit. But behind the scenes, it represented the strengthening of a faction that had waited patiently for decades. Power around the papacy moved in cycles. One family rose, another fell. Alliances were forged through marriages and dissolved through feuds. Some popes attempted to break free from these networks to rule independently. Their reigns were often short, turbulent, and marked by scandals or internal sabotage. The system resisted disruption. Continuity favored those who had mastered the art of patient influence. The papal court itself was a world unlike any other. Cardinals wore scarlet robes, but beneath the ritualistic grandeur were personal ambitions as fierce as any royal court. The Vatican's finances were a vast river of tithes, land rents, trade revenues, and diplomatic gifts. Handling this wealth required bankers, trusted bankers. And who were these bankers? Often the very families who held noble privileges in Italy, France, and beyond. The church depended on them as much as monarchs did. And so influence grew. A cardinal indebted to a noble house for his lifestyle or political rise would remember that support. A pope whose election had been secured by a quiet coalition would repay it in subtle ways. An ambassador negotiating with the Vatican might find that certain families could open doors no amount of gold could. The church was a fortress, but it was also a marketplace of influence. And the families who understood the exchange rates, loyalty, marriage, financial rescue, favors, became experts at shaping decisions without ever appearing to interfere. Yet the most remarkable part of this system was its smoothness. The influence was never chaotic. It was never reckless. The families guided the papacy not to dominate it, but to preserve a balance that ensured stability. A wild or impulsive pope could jeopardize alliances. A pope too aligned with a single monarch could tip the continent into war. The quiet influence of noble families kept the papacy centered, predictable, and efficient. Over centuries, this influence became tradition. New families rose into the ranks of the Black Nobility, while older ones carried their legacy forward. Their coat of arms lined cathedral walls. Their palaces dotted the hills of Rome and the waterfronts of Venice. Their names recurred in Vatican archives like recurring motifs in a long symphony. To the outside world, history appeared chaotic: battles, assassinations, schisms, crusades. But behind the scenes, there was a thread of continuity woven through the church by families who understood that influence is strongest when it is patient, subtle, and silent. Eventually, as Europe modernized, the overt political power of the papacy diminished. But the legacy of those centuries remained. The systems built by these families, their networks, their methods, their alliances did not vanish. They evolved. Influence moved from palaces to banks, from conclaves to boardrooms, from cardinals to consultants and financiers. And yet, one truth remained unchanged. The families who once shaped the papal throne learned that true power does not shout. It whispers. Before the modern world built skyscrapers of steel and glass, before stock exchanges hummed with digital numbers, before multinational corporations quietly shaped nations, there existed another kind of empire, one made not of land or armies but of money. It was a silent empire, invisible to those who did not understand its mechanisms, yet powerful enough to influence kings, alter wars, and redirect the course of history. This was the birth of banking, and for the noble families who mastered it, it became a tool far more potent than any sword. In the early centuries of Europe's growth, wealth was measured in soil and soldiers. A nobleman's strength came from how many acres he owned, how many peasants worked his fields, how many knights answered his call. But land could be seized. Armies could be defeated. Borders could change in a single season. The families who would later be called the Black Nobility recognized that true power needed to flow, quietly, constantly, and across borders. And nothing flowed better than money. Banking, at first, seemed dull to aristocratic rivals. It lacked the glamour of war, the prestige of court life, the romance of diplomacy. Yet these families saw what others did not. Every ruler eventually needed funds, whether for a crusade, a marriage alliance, a palace renovation, or simply to stay in power. That need became the opening through which the families extended their influence into the very heart of every empire. Picture a medieval monarch preparing for war. He stands at a window, overlooking a courtyard filled with soldiers ready to march. The banners are raised. The horses are saddled. The heralds make their announcements. But beneath all this grandeur lies a more pressing question. How will he pay for it? Armies require wages. Armor requires crafting. Food must be bought, weapons forged, ships built. Glory may inspire men, but gold moves them. And so the king sends a messenger, not to a fellow monarch, but to a banker. A quiet man in a quiet room, surrounded not by guards but by ledgers. The noble families who controlled these early banks would listen, sip wine, exchange pleasantries, and then name their terms. Sometimes the price was high interest. Sometimes it was a political favor. Sometimes it was a marriage alliance. But always, without exception, the loan came with invisible strings. When the king rode into battle carrying a banner of victory, he often did not realize he carried another banner as well. One stitched with obligations, written in the ink of debt, signed in rooms lit by flickering candles, witnessed by men who never appeared on the battlefield. As Europe expanded through trade routes and maritime ambition, banking became even more central. Merchant ships needed financing. Ports needed investment. Trade agreements required backers. The families who controlled capital became gatekeepers to opportunity. They could decide which ships sailed, which trade routes flourished, which cities grew rich. If you follow history's great economic shifts, you will find their fingerprints everywhere, though faintly. When the wool trade exploded in England, certain noble houses quietly funded the merchants. When the spice trade connected East and West, their money flowed into fleets. When the Renaissance blossomed into a cultural revolution, their financial networks funded artists, sculptors, architects, and scholars. But unlike the Medici, who proudly showcased their patronage, the families associated with the Black Nobility preferred anonymity. Their investments were discreet. Their records kept in private archives. Their influence passed through whispered agreements, not public declarations. Imagine one of their banking halls, not grand like a royal throne room, but elegant in its simplicity. marble floors, dark wooden desks, tall windows overlooking bustling streets. A clerk records figures in a ledger while a nobleman signs a contract with a single flourish of his quill. No crowd cheers. No artist paints the moment. Yet the quiet transaction will ripple outward for decades, shaping events far beyond the room's walls. This was the first invisible empire, and its power grew in ways the old world could not yet comprehend. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many European monarchs were deeply entangled in webs of credit. Some owed money to families in Venice. Others borrowed from Genoese or Florentine houses. Still others relied on Roman financiers whose wealth came indirectly from church revenues. The families became indispensable. Their letters crisscrossed Europe like veins carrying the lifeblood of the continent's politics. Their households were multilingual, educated, and deeply informed. More informed sometimes than the rulers themselves. They understood currency fluctuations before kings even knew what inflation was. They predicted market crashes long before merchants sensed trouble. They knew which kingdoms were secretly on the brink of bankruptcy. They knew which alliances were unstable. They knew which wars were unwinnable before a single arrow was fired. This knowledge was power. Not power wielded with force, but power exercised through timing, strategy, and foresight. Whenever a king failed to repay a loan, the families acted not with aggression but with opportunity. Perhaps they demanded trading privileges, or the rights to collect taxes in a region, or influence over ecclesiastical appointments, or simply an agreement for future political support. These were not punishments, they were investments in deeper, long-term influence. Debt became the quiet tether binding rulers to families whose names the public barely knew. Yet the most fascinating aspect of this financial empire was its adaptability. When monarchies fell, the families lost nothing. Their wealth was not tied to any single ruler. When rebellions erupted, they simply shifted their investments. When plagues devastated cities, they acquired properties at undervalued prices. When empires expanded, they followed the opportunities. When empires collapsed, they collected on old debts or forgave them in exchange for new alliances. They were not gamblers. They were strategists. Their banking networks created something Europe had never seen before, a class of power unbound by national borders. They could influence France while living in Italy. They could shape trade routes in Spain while negotiating treaties in Austria. They could fund wars in northern Europe while building palaces in southern cities. And as their reach expanded, monarchs began to understand a truth they had long avoided. Armies might win battles, but banking families determined the future. This realization changed the relationship between rulers and nobles. Kings began to fear the men who financed them more than the armies who opposed them. Emperors understood that a banker's refusal could be more devastating than a rebel's uprising. The papacy realized that control of finances meant control of influence. And the families knew it too. They never boasted. They never declared themselves rulers. They never sought thrones. They sought something far more enduring: leverage. Leverage that could not be taken in a coup. Leverage that did not crumble with regimes. Leverage that flowed quietly, like the unseen current beneath a calm ocean. And as their financial empire expanded across the continent, the noble houses who mastered banking became the architects of a new kind of power. One that shaped Europe not through conquest, but through credit. They had built an empire without borders. An empire without soldiers. An empire without a crown. And for the first time in history, power moved silently through ledgers instead of swords. There is a difference between being powerful and being untouchable. Many families in history achieved the first. Very few mastered the second. Those who did learned a truth most nobles never understood. Survival does not depend on how brightly you shine, but on how carefully you control the shadows around you. The families later associated with the Black Nobility perfected this art long before the world even had a name for it. They learned to stay hidden, strategically, deliberately, brilliantly. Imagine Europe in the centuries when thrones were fragile and crowns were perilous. A nobleman who flaunted his influence could become the target of a king's paranoia, a rival's dagger, or a mob's fury. But a nobleman who understood subtlety could outlive every danger. These families developed an instinct for invisibility, not as cowards, but as architects of long-term power. They did not want temporary glory. They wanted generational influence. One of their most effective strategies was selective visibility. They showed themselves only when necessary, at weddings, funerals, coronations, and official ceremonies. They dressed elegantly but never extravagantly. They maintained estates but avoided drawing attention to their wealth. Their public statements were measured, neutral, and diplomatic. They were present enough to be respected, but absent enough to avoid scrutiny. Their true discussions happened behind closed doors, in private courtyards shielded by high stone walls, in libraries filled with manuscripts, and in candlelit salons where servants were sworn to secrecy. These gatherings were not secret societies. They were strategic meetings. A handful of men and women would sip wine, review letters from distant courts, discuss shifting alliances, and carefully decide which direction the political winds were about to blow. And then, without a trace, they would adjust their course. Sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically, but always in a way that kept their name out of gossip and their fingerprints off major decisions. Another weapon in their arsenal was the marriage alliance. But unlike other noble families, who married for land or prestige, these families married for invisibility. A daughter might wed a powerful duke, thereby weaving the family into a broader network without publicly elevating their own profile. A son might marry into a declining house, rescuing it financially while quietly absorbing its connections. Marriages were not events. They were long-term strategies designed to deepen roots and strengthen influence without drawing unwanted attention. The families also mastered the art of shifting allegiances. While many nobles chose sides in conflicts, supporting one claimant to a throne or aligning with one royal faction, the Black Nobility families remained flexible. They might support one side quietly while preparing a backup alliance with the other. Should one ruler fall, they would already be positioned to support the successor. This was not opportunism. It was survival. And over time, it created the impression that these families were always on the winning side, even when the world descended into chaos. Their wealth helped, but not in the obvious ways. They did not flaunt their riches in golden thrones or extravagant feasts. Instead, they invested in quiet ventures, trade routes that generated consistent income, banking networks that connected them to distant monarchies, estates that produced stable revenue. Wealth, for them, was not a display, it was a shield. It allowed them independence from the whims of kings. A ruler could punish a boisterous rival by seizing lands or titles, but he could not easily punish a family that kept its assets distributed across different regions, currencies, and institutions. Knowledge was another pillar of their hidden power. While many nobles focused on military training or court etiquette, these families educated their children in languages, mathematics, history, diplomacy, and the mechanics of trade. A son who knew 3 languages could gather information across borders. A daughter trained in etiquette and cultural customs could move gracefully through any royal court, learning more in a single evening than spies could gather in a month. They valued intelligence as much as influence, and that combination made them exceptionally difficult to undermine. They also cultivated anonymity, not the anonymity of the poor or powerless, but the anonymity of quiet significance. Their family names did appear in public records, but always in positions adjacent to power, never overstated. They were advisors rather than rulers, financiers rather than generals, counselors rather than kings. This secondary position was intentional. A king could be overthrown, a general could be assassinated, but an advisor could simply step into the shadows and wait for the next ruler to call. Because someone always did. Perhaps the most subtle technique these families used was the creation of layers, layers of influence, layers of responsibility, layers of reputation. If a decision led to success, the ruler took credit. If it led to failure, the family's involvement was invisible. They created a buffer between themselves and the consequences of their actions. A public figure might execute their strategy, but the families stayed in the background, insulated from backlash. This layering extended into their archives. While many noble families recorded events in grand chronicles filled with praise and self-glorification, the Black Nobility families kept their records private. Their letters were coded. Their financial accounts were split across multiple ledgers. Their archives were stored in hidden rooms guarded by trusted custodians. Knowledge was their most valuable currency, and they protected it fiercely. All of this created an aura of mystery around them. Outsiders noticed that these families seemed remarkably stable, even during catastrophic times. They noticed that their lands were rarely confiscated, their estates rarely attacked, their influence rarely diminished. They noticed that rumors swirled around them. Rumors of secret meetings, ancient privileges, and uncanny foresight. And where rumor thrives, legend follows. The public began to imagine them as omniscient puppet masters. In reality, their power was more practical and more human. They did not manipulate every event. They simply understood the currents of history better than most. They did not control kings. They influenced them at the right moment. They did not avoid conflict by chance. They avoided it because they recognized danger before it arrived. Their genius was not supernatural. It was strategic invisibility. And so, as centuries passed, the families held onto their influence not through aggression, but through quiet mastery of the one rule too many rulers failed to learn. The most powerful force is the one that leaves no visible trace. The fall of Venice did not happen in one dramatic moment. No single battle marked the end. No sudden collapse shattered the city's ancient pride. Instead, its decline came quietly, like the slow erosion of stone beneath the constant touch of water. By the time Europe realized Venice was no longer the queen of the seas, the families who had shaped her destiny were already gone. Not vanished, but transformed. They had slipped from the sinking city like shadows leaving a dimming lantern, carrying with them the knowledge, networks, and influence that had defined Venice's power for centuries. Venice's noble houses were never bound by the city's walls. They had always thought in terms of continents, not canals. So when trade routes shifted, when new empires rose, when the Ottoman threat grew, and when the tides of commerce no longer favored the lagoon, these families did not cling stubbornly to tradition. They adapted with the same fluidity that had once defined their maritime empire. They followed opportunity, not blindly, but with deliberate, calculated steps that allowed them to integrate seamlessly into the broader fabric of European aristocracy. Imagine a grand Venetian palazzo slowly decaying by the water's edge. Paint fades, stone cracks, the once bustling courtyard falls silent. Gondolas no longer queue outside its entrance. To an outsider, it would appear the family living within has fallen from grace. But in truth, the heirs are no longer there. They reside in Vienna now, influencing imperial decisions. Or in Paris, attending royal councils. Or in Madrid, financing expeditions to the New World. The empty palazzo is a shell, beautiful, but irrelevant to the flows of power that have already shifted elsewhere. The Venetian diaspora of noble families was not a scattering. It was a strategic expansion. They took with them everything that had made Venice a force: diplomatic cunning, financial acumen, multilingual education, and an unparalleled understanding of how to navigate between rival powers. In many ways, they became even more influential once freed from the constraints of their city-state. Some integrated into the courts of Austria. The Habsburg Empire, with its sprawling lands and perpetual need for resources, became a fertile ground for Venetian expertise. Venetian families brought with them not only wealth, but a mastery of trade logistics and political maneuvering. Advising emperors was not new to them. They had already advised doges, popes, and monarchs. Their skills fit perfectly into the imperial structures that stretched across Central Europe. Others turned toward France. The French court, lavish, intricate, and endlessly political, was an ideal environment for those trained in the subtleties of Venetian diplomacy. Behind the glittering chandeliers and elaborate etiquette, there was a constant struggle for influence. Venetian families entered these circles with quiet confidence, offering financial support, cultural refinement, and connections that reached deep into the Mediterranean world. Over time, some became advisors to ministers, patrons of the arts, or financiers of royal projects. In England, their presence was more discreet but no less impactful. London, with its rising merchant class and growing naval ambition, became a playground for those who understood maritime trade better than anyone. Venetian knowledge of shipping routes, port monopolies, and long-distance logistics proved invaluable to English expansion. Quietly, these families entered partnerships with English merchants, invested in overseas companies, and contributed to a financial revolution that would eventually make London the center of global banking. Spain, too, became a destination. The Spanish Empire, flush with gold from the Americas, needed infrastructures of finance more sophisticated than what it possessed. Venetian families filled this gap. Their expertise in credit systems, international trade, and resource management helped stabilize Spain's imperial finances, even as internal struggles threatened to tear it apart. Through marriage, wealth, and diplomacy, the Venetian nobles merged into the aristocracies of Europe. But they carried with them more than influence, they carried the Venetian philosophy of power. That philosophy was simple yet profound. Power works best when it flows quietly, like water filling every available space. Visible authority was fleeting. Invisible influence endured. This mindset reshaped every court they touched. European politics, already complex, became even more intricate as Venetian thought seeped into decision-making processes. Suddenly, rulers found themselves dealing with advisors who seemed to understand geopolitical shifts before they happened. These newcomers saw patterns others missed. They recognized opportunities disguised as disasters and dangers hidden within victories. Consider a diplomatic negotiation between two rival kingdoms. To the monarchs, it was a matter of pride. To their ministers, a matter of policy. But to a Venetian-trained mind, it was a matter of future leverage. A treaty was not a peace agreement, it was a foundation for influence, a tool to guide decades of political movement. While others looked at the present, the Venetian families looked at the implications 3 generations ahead. Their presence in European trade networks deepened as well. In the Netherlands, they connected with powerful merchant guilds. In Germany, they partnered with emerging banking houses. In Portugal, they advised on maritime expeditions and colonial ventures. Like a web extending outward, their influence spread through every port, court, and financial center in Europe. Yet they remained elusive. They did not plaster their names on public monuments. They did not seek royal titles. They did not engage in public rivalry. Their success came from understanding a simple truth. Power accumulates best when no one notices it doing so. This invisibility also protected them during Europe's many upheavals. When monarchies fell, they were already nestled within new administrations. When revolutions erupted, they had already formed quiet alliances with reformers. When empires collapsed, they retained their wealth through international networks no single nation could seize. Venice may have faded, but the families who once steered its destiny became more resilient than ever. Their influence became so widespread that historians today often find their traces in unexpected places. A family crest in a French castle matches one found on a Venetian ship ledger. A marriage contract discovered in a German archive links a Central European duchy to an obscure Venetian house. A banking document in London reveals the signature of a family whose origins trace back to the Rialto. These fragments are the breadcrumbs that hint at a story far larger and more intricate than most realize. The Venetian web did not vanish. It expanded. No longer tied to a single city, it became a multinational network of influence woven across the courts and markets of Europe. It was not a conspiracy, there was no central command, no secret orders. It was a culture, a tradition of strategic invisibility passed down through generations. And though the canals of Venice grew quieter, the influence of her noble families flowed more widely than ever, silent currents shaping decisions, economies, alliances, and the destinies of nations. Because Venice may have lost her empire of water, but her families gained an empire of shadows. Europe has always loved the idea of visible power. Kings on thrones, generals on horseback, queens in jeweled courts. But behind the velvet curtains and polished marble floors, there existed a subtler theater, one far more decisive than any coronation or royal decree. These were the shadow courts of Europe, places where decisions were made not with proclamations, but with murmurs. Not with swords, but with glances. Not with force, but with influence woven silently from family to family, council to council. To walk into one of these courts in the 15th or 16th century was to enter a world where every gesture carried meaning. The chandeliers sparkled, the tapestries glowed with gold thread, but true power shimmered in the conversations that drifted behind pillars, beneath staircases, or across long dining tables where nothing spoken aloud was ever said without calculation. This was the realm where the Venetian nobles, the Roman houses, and the old European dynasties displayed their true mastery. Imagine a royal palace in France. The king sits on his throne, the symbol of authority, yet the courtiers around him exchange subtle nods and coded phrases. A seemingly innocent remark about the weather might disguise a warning about political unrest. A compliment about a dress might hint at an upcoming marriage alliance. A request to borrow a book could be the first step in forming a discreet diplomatic channel. Those who took words at face value found themselves lost. Those who understood the layers beneath them became architects of fate. Into this world came the families who once ruled Venice's hidden chambers and Rome's political corridors. They were not flamboyant arrivals. They did not burst into courts with fanfare. They entered quietly, often as guests, advisors, or companions to more visible nobles. Yet their presence altered the energy of a room like a drop of ink spreading through clear water. They brought with them a sophistication Europe admired, a patience Europe feared, and a silence Europe did not understand. To the casual observer, these families seemed like any other aristocrats. They danced at balls. They attended feasts. They rode in processions behind kings and queens. But observe more closely, and their distinctiveness emerged. They rarely engaged in open rivalries. They avoided the loud competitions for titles that consumed lesser nobles. Instead, they cultivated relationships with the people who truly mattered, those who influenced the monarch's decisions, those who oversaw diplomatic channels, those who managed estates, those who controlled information. Power in these courts was not taken. It was absorbed. One could see their influence in small details. A treaty would be delayed because a noble advisor suggested a minor revision. A royal marriage proposal would be reconsidered due to a whisper about a more suitable alliance. A general would receive funding not because the king thought it wise, but because a financier had expressed quiet approval. Each action appeared to come from the throne. But in truth, the throne was often reacting to currents gently guided by hands that never reached for a crown. Across Europe, these shadow courts evolved differently depending on the nation, but the pattern remained consistent. In Spain, where the royal household was steeped in formality and ritual, influence moved through confessional chambers, dining salons, and long walks in palace gardens. A single private conversation with the queen could redirect foreign policy. A discreet letter from a cardinal could shift the balance of a royal council. Here, the families operated like chess masters, anticipating the mood swings of monarchs who balanced an empire covering half the world. In Austria, power flowed through the imperial court, a massive, multi-layered institution where bureaucracy itself became a battlefield. The Habsburg rulers depended on dozens of advisors, each with their own sphere: military, diplomatic, ecclesiastical, financial. Venetian and Roman nobles thrived here. They understood how to navigate bureaucratic labyrinths, how to influence not just the emperor but the network of decision-makers around him. They maneuvered within committees, subtly guided tax policies, trade negotiations, and even succession plans. In the German principalities, shadow courts were smaller but far more volatile. Each duchy or state had its own set of ambitions, rivalries, and alliances. A clever noble family could influence a minor prince, who in turn affected regional politics, which then rippled outward to shape imperial decisions. Here, influence moved like wildfire through dry grass, quick, unpredictable, and immensely powerful in the right hands. In England, the game was different still. The English preferred the appearance of transparency, but behind that facade lay a dense web of competing interests: merchants, nobles, religious leaders, explorers, and financiers. The families who once shaped Venice and Rome adapted easily. They understood how to move fluidly between London's courtly rituals and its bustling financial districts. They learned to speak the language of parliamentarians as fluently as they once spoke to doges. They built quiet relationships with individuals who were rising stars in politics, ensuring that as new power structures formed, they were already part of them. These shadow courts were not sinister conspiracies. They were ecosystems, delicate, complex, and constantly evolving. To survive in them required patience, emotional intelligence, and a deep understanding of human nature. These families excelled in all three. Their approach to influence was almost scientific. They mapped relationships the way merchants map trade routes. They studied personalities with the precision of scholars. They identified weaknesses and strengths in monarchs, ministers, cardinals, and generals. They understood that a king who feared loneliness could be swayed through companionship. A queen who valued loyalty could be approached through shared confidences. A minister obsessed with legacy could be shaped by offering opportunities for memorialization. And yet, the most effective tool in these courts was not persuasion, it was timing. These families knew when to speak and when to remain silent, when to press a suggestion and when to let it rest, when to form an alliance and when to withdraw. They recognized that influence applied at the wrong moment was wasted, but influence applied at the perfect moment was unstoppable. The deeper they integrated into the shadow courts, the more Europe's political landscape shifted. Decisions that seemed chaotic or impulsive often had quiet origins in conversations that outsiders never heard. Some wars were prevented by a subtle redirection of a monarch's attention. Others were ignited by a whispered warning about a rival's intentions. Marriages that joined kingdoms were often the result of years of quiet negotiation. Reforms that appeared revolutionary were sometimes the culmination of decades of patient influence. As time passed, the courts themselves began to change. They grew less ceremonial, more administrative. Monarchs realized they needed advisors who could think beyond personal glory. Governments slowly replaced royal households as centers of power. Yet even in this transition, the families adapted seamlessly. They moved from court salons into ministries, from palace corridors into diplomatic embassies, from royal patronage into banking consortia, universities, and councils of science, commerce, and aristocracy. The shadow court never disappeared. It simply changed shape. It became the fabric underlying European governance, the quiet understanding that beneath every visible structure lay an invisible one, older, wiser, and more deeply rooted. A structure shaped not by elections or coronations, but by centuries of strategy and survival. These families learned to work within every system not because they were manipulative, but because they recognized that history itself is shaped in the spaces between events, the pauses, the whispers, the silences. And in those silences, they found their greatest strength. The rise of global empires did not simply redraw the map of the world, it rewrote the very meaning of power. As ships began to cross oceans that once seemed endless, as new continents were charted and claimed, as gold and spices and silk flowed into Europe in staggering quantities, the old world transformed. Kingdoms became empires, merchants became magnates, and noble families, those ancient architects of influence, found themselves standing at the threshold of a new era where opportunity and danger walked hand in hand. For centuries, these families had perfected their craft in European courts, navigating politics, shaping alliances, guiding papal decisions, and directing financial currents. But now the world was opening. Oceans became highways. The Mediterranean was no longer the center of trade. Power was shifting toward nations with access to the Atlantic and beyond: Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, England, France. The families who once ruled Venice's waters and Rome's courts understood instinctively that standing still meant losing everything. And so, with the same quiet resolve that defined their legacy, they adapted once more. Imagine the dawn of the age of exploration. Massive ships sit anchored in European harbors, their hulls creaking with potential. Sailors chant as they load crates of food, weapons, and supplies. The atmosphere is thick with anticipation, of wealth, of glory, of unexplored worlds. Yet behind this excitement lies a quieter exchange. A nobleman meets with a ship captain in the privacy of a warehouse. A banker signs a discreet agreement with a monarch planning a colonial expedition. A marriage alliance links a European noble house to a merchant family whose fleets will soon sail for distant shores. These meetings, unrecorded by official histories, helped shape the age that followed. The noble families did not seek to own colonies. They sought to influence the empires that built them. They understood that the real prize was not land, but control over trade routes, shipping monopolies, and financial instruments that could turn exploration into empire. And so they invested not with fanfare but with precision. In Portugal, they formed ties with maritime dynasties who mapped the coast of Africa and opened trade to India. They funded ships, insured voyages, and established themselves as silent partners in ventures that would enrich Europe for centuries. Their knowledge of trade, diplomacy, and negotiation blended seamlessly with Portugal's exploratory ambitions. In Spain, they saw opportunity in the empire's newfound wealth from the New World. Gold and silver flooded into Spanish coffers, creating both prosperity and instability. The noble families stepped in as financial stabilizers, providing loans, managing bullion shipments, and advising on colonial administration. They helped convert raw wealth into structured power, though always from the safety of the shadows. The Netherlands offered something different, a rising merchant republic driven not by monarchs but by corporations. The Dutch East India Company, the world's first multinational corporation, became a magnet for those who understood the mechanics of global trade. Venetian and Italian families quietly collaborated with Dutch financiers, sharing techniques of risk assessment, ledger systems, and long-distance communication networks. Their influence merged with Dutch innovation, creating financial instruments that would become the backbone of modern capitalism. In France, the families found a monarchy eager to expand its reach across the world. French colonization in the Americas, Africa, and Asia needed funding, strategy, and administrative expertise. The noble houses offered advice, credit, and diplomatic insight. They helped France build alliances and navigate competition with Britain and Spain. Their presence in French salons and financial institutions was subtle yet profound. England became perhaps the most fascinating stage of all. Its emerging empire relied heavily on maritime trade and private ventures. The noble families recognized early that England's power would not come from land but from sea, from ships, ports, and the commercial networks surrounding them. They moved into London's financial districts, investing in chartered companies like the East India Company, advising merchants, and forming partnerships with rising political figures. Their influence blended into the bustling tapestry of English commerce, hidden yet deeply effective. As global trade expanded, the family's networks grew more intricate. They negotiated with sultans in the Ottoman Empire, advised on treaties with Mughal India, and helped shape missions to China and Japan. Their letters traveled on merchant ships. Their agents kept eyes on colonial markets. Their investments followed the shifting winds of opportunity. They became early globalists not in ideology but in practice. Their financial empire evolved too. Banking transformed from lending to monarchs into a sophisticated web of credit systems that linked continents. Insurance markets emerged to protect ships and cargo. Stock exchanges began to form. The noble families adapted to each development, often helping invent the very systems they benefited from. Yet through all this expansion, they remained remarkably discreet. They allowed merchants, explorers, and monarchs to take the glory. Their names rarely appeared in official records of colonial success. But their influence was everywhere, woven into the economic systems that made expansion possible. One might imagine a dimly lit office in Amsterdam where a Venetian-born accountant calculates the risks of a voyage to the East Indies. Or a Parisian salon where a noblewoman from an old Roman family subtly encourages a minister to support a colonial governor. Or a London counting house where a banker traces the flow of silver from South America to China, predicting market shifts years before they occur. They were not conquerors. They were orchestrators. Their skill lay not in wielding force but in understanding its cost, in anticipating its consequences, in shaping its direction without stepping onto the battlefield. They recognized that the greatest advantage of global empire was not territorial expansion, it was information. Every ship returning to Europe brought not just goods, but intelligence. Every letter from a colonial outpost contained clues about the future of trade, politics, and global power. And as the families absorbed this information, they strengthened their influence over Europe. It was during this period that their reputation began to stretch beyond simple aristocratic influence. Some saw them as visionaries ahead of their time. Others saw them as secretive manipulators working across borders. As global empires grew, so did the aura surrounding these families, blending admiration with suspicion, fact with mythology. What made their role so remarkable was not the scale of their power, but the subtlety of it. They did not sit on thrones or command armies, yet they steered the world toward globalization long before the word existed. They did not claim empires, but they shaped the empires that came to dominate the world. And as the age of exploration transformed into the age of empire, their influence became so embedded in the systems of trade, finance, diplomacy, and politics that Europe's rise itself could not be separated from the quiet presence of the families who had once ruled Venice's canals and Rome's corridors. They had expanded from a city-state to the world, not by conquest, but by quiet mastery of the currents that carried nations into new eras. If Europe was the old stage on which noble families perfected their craft, then America was the new world where they tested it. Not with armies or royal courts this time, but through quieter channels: finance, trade, diplomacy, and opportunity. When the New World emerged as a force of its own, the ancient families of Europe recognized something extraordinary. Here was a land unshaped by centuries of aristocratic lineage, yet destined to become one of the most powerful centers of influence on the planet. And in that gap, between tradition and ambition, they found room to breathe, to expand, and to subtly imprint their legacy on a country that prided itself on being free from old-world nobility. America, in its early years, seemed allergic to aristocracy. It rejected kings, dismissed titles, and distrusted anything that resembled hereditary privilege. But what America did not reject was money. It did not reject knowledge, nor connections, nor international experience. And so the families who had quietly shaped Europe did not need to announce themselves when they arrived. They did not need to carry crests or coats of arms. They came disguised as investors, advisors, merchants, diplomats, scholars. America saw them as opportunity, never as threat. Imagine a bustling port in Boston or New York in the late 1700s. Ships arrive carrying goods from London, Amsterdam, Venice, and Lisbon. Merchants unload crates of textiles and spices to be sold in markets brimming with newcomers hungry for prosperity. Somewhere in this chaos, a man in refined clothing steps onto the dock. His accent hints at Europe, but his purpose is entirely American. He is not here to impose tradition. He is here to build something new. Yet the ledger he carries contains the handwriting of a family whose influence spans centuries. In these early decades, America was a blank canvas, a place where banking structures were still forming, where political factions were still crystallizing, where industries were still emerging. The noble families recognized this not as chaos, but as opportunity. They did what they had always done best. They filled the spaces left empty by others. Some began with trade, funding shipping routes between the American colonies and European markets. Others invested in early American banks, offering knowledge and stability that local financiers desperately needed. A few entered diplomacy, advising American representatives in Europe and smoothing relations with powerful monarchies. Their influence was never dominating. America would have rejected that. It was supportive, foundational, invisible in its subtlety. When the United States fought for independence, some European families quietly backed the revolutionaries. Not because they believed in freedom, but because they believed in strategy. A new nation with no aristocratic elite of its own was fertile ground for influence. When the war ended and America began building its institutions, these families were ready. Through business partnerships, financial loans, and diplomatic guidance, they helped the young nation find footing in a world dominated by old powers. Consider the early American banks, many modeled after European systems. Behind the scenes, advisors trained in Italian, Dutch, and Austrian financial traditions helped structure credit networks, stabilize currencies, and build the backbone of American commerce. Their names rarely appeared on official documents, yet their signatures were present in every design, quietly shaping the nation's economic future. As America expanded westward, the noble families expanded with it. They invested in railways, mining companies, trading houses, and shipping firms. They collaborated with emerging American dynasties, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, the Rockefellers. These partnerships became the bridge between Old World aristocracy and New World capitalism. By the 19th century, the influence became more pronounced. European families began marrying into American wealthy households, forging alliances that combined Old World prestige with New World wealth. A daughter of an Italian noble house might wed the heir to a New York banking dynasty. A son of an Austrian lineage might marry into a Boston political family. These alliances blurred the lines between continents, merging centuries of aristocratic strategy with the explosive energy of American ambition. Diplomatically, the families found another avenue. They advised American presidents visiting Europe, negotiated trade treaties, and facilitated introductions to powerful royal courts. Their knowledge of European politics, earned through centuries of navigating complex alliances, gave America an advantage it did not yet realize it needed. A single letter from a Roman or Venetian descendant could open doors in Paris or Vienna that would otherwise remain shut. Yet for all their influence, the families remained largely unknown to the American public. America celebrated its generals, inventors, and industrial titans, but it did not recognize the invisible threads connecting these figures to the Old World. It did not see the quiet conversations that shaped diplomatic strategies, the investments that funded early industries, the marriages that connected continents, the letters that influenced foreign policy. To the families, this invisibility was perfect. They had no desire to dominate American politics openly. They were not seeking thrones or titles. They were continuing a legacy refined over 1,000 years, guiding power from behind the curtain, not from center stage. And yet, their influence in America carried a unique twist. Unlike Europe, where lineage ruled, America offered mobility, fast, unpredictable, explosive mobility. The noble families had to adapt quickly. They shifted from slow-moving, meticulous strategies to rapid investments and bold ventures. They learned to navigate a system where fortunes were made and lost overnight. They partnered with industrialists who cared little for tradition but understood raw ambition. Through these alliances, the families became more modern, more dynamic, more integrated into the new age. Their influence was no longer just financial or diplomatic. It was cultural. They supported universities, sponsored artists, funded museums, and contributed to the shaping of America's intellectual landscape. They encouraged the spread of European art and philosophy, introducing American elites to Renaissance thought, classical architecture, and continental elegance. They helped build libraries, orchestras, and scientific institutions. Their legacy extended beyond politics into the cultural DNA of the nation. By the dawn of the 20th century, the families had become so woven into the American fabric that disentangling their story from the country's rise became nearly impossible. They were both foreign and domestic, ancient and modern, rooted in Europe yet thriving in America. Their influence was not a conspiracy, nor a secret cabal. It was the natural evolution of a legacy that refused to die, a tradition of strategic adaptability stretching across oceans and centuries. America believed it had broken free from old aristocracy. But the truth was far more subtle. The old world had not disappeared. It had simply changed address. Revolutions do not announce themselves politely. They erupt, sudden, violent, driven by hunger, fury, and desperation. They tear down thrones, topple ancient systems, and sweep aside the proudest dynasties with the force of a raging tide. And when the age of revolutions ignited across Europe, from Paris to Vienna to the Italian city-states, it seemed as though no aristocracy could survive. The world was changing too fast, too chaotically. Kings were executed, palaces burned. Symbols of privilege were smashed and trampled beneath the feet of angry crowds. Yet somehow, amid this roar of upheaval, certain families endured, not by resisting the tide, but by moving with it quietly, precisely, almost invisibly. It is tempting to imagine revolutions as events that happen overnight. In truth, they build slowly, like pressure beneath the earth, until one spark ignites everything. When the French Revolution erupted, nobles fled in fear, carrying jewels and gold sewn into their clothing. Titles were abolished. Lands were seized. The old world seemed to crumble in real time. Historians still debate how Europe's hidden aristocratic families reacted, but the pattern is unmistakable. They survived at a rate far higher than the flamboyant nobility whose names filled history books. Part of their survival came from instinct. For generations, they had never relied on thrones. They had never tied their destinies too tightly to any one monarchy. Their wealth was diversified. Their alliances spread across borders. Their influence distributed like finely spun threads throughout society. When a king fell, they did not fall with him. When a government collapsed, they had already cultivated relationships with the factions that rose to replace it. Imagine a noble house in northern Italy watching the flames of revolution flickering on the horizon. Other families panic, sending heirs to distant estates, bribing troops, pleading with foreign monarchs. But this particular house remains oddly calm. In their private archives, they have letters from intellectuals, reformers, and moderate revolutionaries. They have supported educational institutions and churches that remain respected even in times of upheaval. Their children have friends across every political divide. They do not stand against the revolution. They simply step to the side and let it pass. When the dust settles, they are still there. This was not luck. It was preparation. Another advantage they possessed was adaptability. While many nobles clung desperately to symbols of the old order, these families embraced change long before it arrived. They supported reforms, funded infrastructure, invested in new industries, and aligned themselves with emerging merchant classes. They understood that revolutions were not the end of power, but the end of a particular style of power: loud, visible, ostentatious. Their style was none of those things. Their influence was designed to survive political earthquakes. In France, some noble families rebranded themselves as industrialists, bankers, or intellectual patrons. They reinvented their identities in ways that allowed them to thrive under new regimes. A family that once advised a king might now advise revolutionary leaders or Republican ministers. Their role changed, but their presence remained. In Austria and the German states, revolutions were less explosive but still transformative. The noble families adjusted by embracing the rise of bureaucracy and constitutional governance. They placed their heirs in administrative positions, universities, diplomatic corps, and financial institutions. As monarchies shifted from absolute to symbolic power, these families simply stepped sideways into the real machinery of government. Italy proved even more complex. The movements for unification swept across the peninsula, challenging ancient structures and regional identities. Some noble families chose to resist the changes and were crushed. Others, especially those with Venetian or Roman heritage, recognized an opportunity. By supporting unification at the right moments, by funding key figures, by aligning themselves with the emerging New Italy, they secured positions in the modern state. Their palaces might have lost some authority, but their influence gained new pathways. It is in this era that an interesting twist appears. Revolutions were intended to destroy aristocratic power. Instead, in some cases, they strengthened the families best equipped to navigate uncertainty. When old hierarchies collapsed, new hierarchies, financial, bureaucratic, diplomatic, emerged to replace them. And these families, with centuries of strategic intelligence, stepped smoothly into those new roles. Picture a parliamentary chamber in the 1840s. Heated debates fill the air. Ideologies clash. New laws are proposed. Outside the chamber, a man sits quietly in conversation with a minister. He is not a noble in the traditional sense, no title, no flashy display. But his family has guided politics for generations. His words carry weight not because of status, but because of trust built over centuries. The revolution has changed the scenery, but the script remains influenced by familiar voices. Another paradox of the revolutionary era was that secrecy became an asset. In times of upheaval, visible power was dangerous. Public figures were targeted, vilified, or swept aside by shifting mobs. But families who had spent centuries cultivating discretion now found themselves perfectly positioned. Their influence did not rely on public recognition. They advised behind the scenes, with nothing for the revolutionaries to tear down. By the time Europe stabilized in the late 19th century, The families who survived were not necessarily the ones with the strongest armies or the grandest titles. They were the ones who had mastered the quiet arts. Subtlety, patience, timing, reinvention. The ones who had learned not to cling to any single form of power, but to move fluidly with history's shifting tides. Revolutions did not eliminate the hidden aristocracy. They refined it. They stripped away the families who relied on spectacle and privilege. They rewarded those who understood that real power survives by stepping out of the spotlight. And in the silence that followed the chaos, these families emerged once again, not as relics of the past, but as architects of Europe's uncertain future. By the time Europe entered the modern age, crowns no longer carried the weight they once did. Kings still wore jewels, queens still hosted grand balls, and royal courts still glittered with ceremony. But the real centers of gravity were shifting. Parliaments were rising. Newspapers shaped public opinion. Banks financed governments. Universities formed elite networks. Intelligence agencies collected quiet truths. Industrialists built empires of steel and electricity. And through this transformation, the descendants of Europe's oldest families made a remarkable realization. The age of thrones was fading, but the age of networks was beginning. They adapted with characteristic subtlety. These families had never depended on visible power. Their strength came from relationships, alliances, information, and influence woven across generations. So when monarchies weakened, they did not mourn the old system. They recognized that the new world offered something even more potent, an intricate lattice of institutions, committees, councils, financial networks, and social spheres where decisions were made not by kings, but by groups of educated, interconnected elites. In this world, they did not need titles. They needed access. Imagine Europe at the dawn of the 20th century. Factories rise like giants. Railways cut through ancient landscapes. Telegraph lines whisper across borders. Governments expand to manage new economies. The church adjusts to maintain relevance in a world no longer dominated by faith. In the midst of all this change, the old noble families move smoothly into positions that matter, not necessarily the ones that draw public attention. A son might study law at an elite university in Paris, where he forms friendships with future ministers, editors, and diplomats. A daughter might join cultural societies, where she forges connections with influential philanthropists and intellectuals. A father might sit quietly on the board of a new financial institution, guiding its strategy without ever needing to appear in the newspapers. A mother might host small gatherings in her home, bringing together politicians and industrial magnates under the guise of social elegance. These were the new salons of Europe, not places of gossip, but places of alignment, where ideas crossed paths with ambition. The families understood something essential. Power in the modern era was no longer concentrated. It was distributed across banks, academies, newspapers, think tanks, political parties, trade corporations, and emerging global organizations. The key was not to control one institution, but to be present in all of them, quietly, consistently, strategically. And they excelled. They became board members of banks that financed industrial expansion. They advised ministers crafting new constitutions. They influenced newspaper owners, shaping public narratives through editorial alliances rather than direct orders. They funded scientific societies and universities, ensuring that their worldview subtly permeated the education of future elites. They joined philanthropic foundations, shaping cultural and social initiatives that guided European identity. Their methods were not conspiratorial, they were experiential. For centuries, their families had navigated fragmented courts, shifting alliances, complex diplomacy. Now they navigated modern institutions with the same skill, simply adjusting the tools. Where once they used strategic marriages, they now used corporate partnerships. Where once they funded popes and kings, they now funded universities and political parties. Where once they influenced the Vatican's advisors, they now influenced the experts who drafted government policies. They understood that, in this new world, expertise itself was a currency. A well-placed historian could shape national narratives. A well-placed economist could influence monetary policy. A well-placed legal scholar could draft law. A well-placed journalist could shift elections. A well-placed banker could decide which industries thrived. The families did not need fame. They needed placement. Some people imagine modern influence as a pyramid with a hidden pinnacle. But the truth is more complex. Influence in the 19th and 20th centuries was a network, vast, interlinked, and constantly evolving. And the families who had mastered networks for centuries were perfectly suited to thrive in this new era. Consider a quiet meeting in a Swiss resort, where bankers, aristocrats, diplomats, and industrialists discuss European stability over dinner. Nothing formal is signed. No treaties are proclaimed. But decisions are made about investment flows, about political support, about future cooperation. These decisions ripple outward, shaping events far beyond the room. Consider a conference at a university where scholars debate economic theory. Among them sits a young man from an old family, listening carefully. He is not there to dominate the discussion. He is there to understand the intellectual currents that will guide future policies. He later advises a minister who unknowingly incorporates these ideas into national reforms. Consider a newspaper editorial subtly arguing for calm during a political crisis. The author believes he is acting independently. But the tone, the evidence, the positioning of the argument reflect conversations he had with acquaintances from noble circles weeks earlier, conversations that shaped not his opinion, but the direction of his attention. Networks, not thrones. This became the new reality. As Europe moved into the modern world, through wars, revolutions, alliances, treaties, the old families never tried to resurrect their lost monarchies. They understood the world had changed, but they recognized something deeper. While political systems evolve, human nature remains constant. Ambition, loyalty, fear, hope, and influence still govern the decisions of leaders. And the families who had spent centuries mastering these human truths continued to use them, not through force, but through presence. They built trust over generations. They cultivated reputations for reliability. They offered continuity in a world obsessed with change. This made them indispensable in times of crisis. A new minister facing international pressure might turn to a seasoned advisor from an old family because he trusted their perspective more than any official report. A banker navigating uncertain markets might rely on the quiet counsel of a noble family's descendant whose lineage had weathered dozens of economic storms. At the same time, these families formed bridges between nations. A conversation between a French and an Italian aristocrat could smooth over diplomatic tensions long before governments addressed them. A discreet meeting between Austrian and British elites could redirect alliances. These relationships were not official, but they were real, and often more effective than formal diplomacy. The families had transitioned from rulers to connectors. And in a world increasingly defined by institutions rather than monarchs, connectors held immense power. There is something almost poetic about this transition. Once, influence came from castles and crowns. Now, it flowed through boardrooms and conferences. Once, it was traced through genealogies. Now, it moved through professional networks. Once, it was inherited visibly. Now, it was inherited as a mindset, a philosophy of quiet, strategic presence. The thrones of Europe faded into ceremonial roles. But the networks that replaced them were shaped, in part, by the same families who had long understood that real power thrives not in proclamations, but in the delicate, unseen threads that bind society together. The 20th century began like a match struck in a room soaked with gasoline. Old empires were brittle. Economies strained under the weight of industrial ambition. Nations bristled with pride and insecurity. And beneath the surface, quiet, patient, calculating, the old families who had shaped Europe for centuries sensed the tremors long before the ground began to shake. They had survived revolutions, plagues, conquests, and the rise of new empires. But nothing in their long lineage compared to what the world was about to become, an era defined by global war. The First World War erupted not from a single cause, but from a chain of tensions, rivalries, and miscalculations. Monarchies that had once seemed eternal collapsed in a matter of months. Generals clung to outdated strategies that sacrificed millions. Entire cities fell silent except for the distant thunder of artillery. While nations bled, the noble families watched, many powerless to stop the madness, yet not blind to the transformations it would unleash. Some families had members serving as officers in the armies of Austria, Italy, France, or Germany. They fought and died like ordinary men, swept up in the tidal wave of nationalism. But others, especially those whose influence lay in finance, diplomacy, or commerce, found themselves in an unexpected position. As governments struggled to fund their war machines, they turned once again to banks, credit networks, and financial institutions. War bonds were sold. Emergency loans were negotiated. Entire national budgets were reshaped to feed the conflict. And within these negotiations, certain familiar names resurfaced, not as villains or masterminds, but as indispensable linchpins in an increasingly desperate world. Imagine a meeting in Zurich in 1916. Outside, Europe is engulfed in chaos. Millions are dying in trenches filled with mud and gas. Yet in this quiet city, bankers, diplomats, and advisors from several nations gather in a discreet room lit by oil lamps. They are not there to orchestrate the war. They are there to prevent financial collapse. A single misstep could plunge an entire alliance into ruin. A bad loan could cost a nation its army. A missed payment could tilt the balance of power. And among the suited men at the table sit individuals whose families had once advised popes, financed Venetian fleets, and counseled kings. Their knowledge of crisis management, gained across centuries of turmoil, now becomes invaluable. They do not dictate policy. They stabilize it. They do not choose sides. They calculate risks. They do not seek glory. They seek survival for nations, for economies, and for themselves. When the war finally ended, the world was unrecognizable. Old thrones lay shattered. Empires dissolved into fragments. Borders were redrawn like chalk lines on a schoolroom board. The Treaty of Versailles punished some nations so harshly that economists warned it would plant the seeds of another conflict. And in the vacuum left by fallen monarchies, new forms of power emerged: financial, bureaucratic, corporate, ideological. The noble families, adapting once more, shifted with the world. Some moved into international diplomacy, helping negotiate reparations, restructuring debt, or rebuilding governments. Others invested in industries that rose from the ashes of the war: steel, electricity, transportation. A few retreated temporarily, sensing that the political climate was too unstable for long-term influence. But none disappeared. Their centuries-old instinct for survival remained unbroken. Then, scarcely 2 decades later, the world was engulfed again. This time in a conflict even more devastating, more mechanized, more total. World War II did not simply test the political structures of Europe. It tested its soul. As fascism rose in Italy and Germany, many aristocratic families faced impossible decisions. Some resisted quietly, offering support to underground networks or sheltering dissidents in their estates. Others tried to maintain neutrality, hoping the storm would pass without consuming them. A few were swept up by the seductive promises of nationalist rhetoric. The war fractured the old aristocracy as no event before it had done. Yet the most profound shift came not from battlefields, but from the realms these families had long understood intimately: diplomacy and finance. When nations prepared for war, they again needed credit, vast, unimaginable sums of it. They needed allies. They needed neutral channels of negotiation. Switzerland, Sweden, and Vatican City became crucial hubs, and in each of these places, members of Europe's old families played roles: quiet, discreet, often unrecognized but undeniably significant. Picture a dimly lit office in Bern where a banker receives coded messages from both sides of the conflict. His job is not to sway the war but to prevent economic catastrophe. Picture a diplomat in Lisbon, drinking coffee with representatives from opposing nations, relaying information that could save thousands of lives. Picture a cardinal in Rome, using the church's diplomatic ties to protect refugees, prisoners, or political hostages. These were not grand gestures but vital ones. They embodied a truth these families had known for centuries. Sometimes power lies not in leading armies, but in preventing collapse. But the wars did more than shake the aristocracy. They reshaped it. After 1945, Europe was rebuilt on entirely new foundations: democratic institutions, international alliances, economic unions. Monarchies became symbolic. The church lost political dominance. The military aristocracy faded. The world moved into the era of nation-states, corporations, and global governance. For many families, this might have spelled the end of influence. Instead, it became the beginning of their next transformation. They entered multinational banking, international diplomacy, emerging global organizations. They used their linguistic skills, cultural knowledge, and multi-generational networks to become advisors in a world now defined by cooperation as much as rivalry. They helped negotiate trade agreements, participate in economic councils, support the creation of international institutions, and form alliances that would prevent another catastrophic war. Their influence was not as concentrated as it had been in the Renaissance or the era of city-states. It was more diffused, more complex, more collaborative. But it was still present, woven into the world's new structures like threads from an ancient loom. Strangely, the wars that destroyed so many ancient powers had strengthened something else: the understanding that not all power is visible, that behind every public leader stands a constellation of advisors, financiers, diplomats, thinkers, and families whose experience stretches beyond any single generation. The wars broke empires, but they made dynasties. Not dynasties of thrones, but dynasties of influence, forged in crisis, hardened in survival, prepared for a future where the map of power would be drawn not by kings or conquerors, but by those who understood the delicate machinery of a rapidly changing world. And so, as the smoke of the 20th century's greatest tragedies lifted, the old families emerged once more, scarred, transformed, dispersed, yet unbroken, because they had learned the lesson history teaches only to those who endure long enough to understand it. Visible power can be destroyed. Invisible power adapts, and it survives. The world that emerged after 1945 was not simply rebuilt, it was reimagined. Cities lay in ruins, but ideas rose from the rubble like new architecture. Ideas about peace, cooperation, institutions, and shared futures. For the first time in centuries, power was no longer concentrated in royal courts or imperial palaces. It shifted into conference halls, treaty rooms, international councils, and global organizations. And as nations struggled to shape this new order, the old families, those who had survived every previous transformation, stepped quietly into the roles they were uniquely prepared to fill. They did not return as aristocrats. They returned as architects. The post-war world needed what they possessed: multi-generational memory, diplomatic finesse, financial networks spanning continents, and a deep understanding of how to balance competing interests. They had learned these skills not in universities or modern think tanks, but in the courts of popes, the chambers of doges, the salons of European elites, and the complex webs of influence they had woven over centuries. Now, these talents found new application. Imagine Europe in 1946. Cities bombed into silence. Borders redrawn with trembling hands. Refugees walking roads with no destination. Economies shattered. Armies demoralized. And leaders desperate for stability. Amid this chaos, a series of meetings begins, small at first, then larger. Diplomats gather in dusty rooms lit by bare bulbs, speaking hesitantly about alliances, security, and cooperation. These meetings, though formal on the surface, rely heavily on informal conversations that happen over dinners, walks, and whispered exchanges in hallways. And in those whispers are the voices of individuals whose family histories span empires. A former Austrian aristocrat now works as a diplomatic liaison, using his old connections to help build early European coalitions. An Italian noblewoman serves as an intermediary in Vatican diplomatic circles, calming tensions between nations that still taste bitterness from the war. A descendant of a Venetian merchant dynasty becomes a financial consultant to the newly forming international banks that will stabilize global currencies. None of them hold official titles. Yet the system emerging around them, the United Nations, NATO, the IMF, the European coal and steel community, requires exactly the kind of knowledge they carry silently within them. The world wanted stability. They offered continuity. The world wanted cooperation. They offered networks. The world wanted impartiality. They offered experience that transcended national borders. For centuries, these families had operated in the cracks between nations. Now, those cracks had become the foundation of new global institutions. The European Union, long before it became a formal reality, existed first in private conversations among intellectuals, financiers, diplomats, and visionaries, many of whom came from long-standing families who remembered the cost of disunity. They knew what it meant for Europe to tear itself apart, because their ancestors had witnessed it countless times. Post-war reconstruction was not only economic, it was psychological. Nations needed to relearn trust. Alliances needed to be rebuilt from nothing. And trust, more than money or treaties, was the currency these families had always dealt in. Their names opened doors not because of privilege but because of recognition. Their grandparents had negotiated treaties. Their great-grandparents had funded infrastructure. Their ancestors had written letters between monarchs, settled disputes, arranged alliances. They represented continuity in a world where everything felt uncertain. One can imagine a meeting between two ministers from countries still aching with mutual suspicion. Their official positions demand formality. But then one of them mentions a mutual acquaintance, an old family name both recognize from their histories. Suddenly the conversation softens. Walls lower. A shared heritage becomes a bridge across political divides. Not because of conspiracy, but because memory itself can be a form of diplomacy. The families adapted not only to politics, but to economics. The post-war boom created multinational corporations, new banking systems, global markets, and international trade agreements. The noble families, long adept at moving wealth across borders, placed themselves at the center of these new structures. They served on corporate boards, founded private banks, advised governments on monetary policy, and helped shape the regulations that would define the global economy. Their influence was not overt. They did not control these institutions outright, but they were present, quiet, consistent, interconnected. They understood that the world was becoming too complex for centralized power. Influence needed to flow like water, moving through channels and conduits that connected industries, governments, and societies. And so they built networks, professional, academic, cultural, and philanthropic. A German noble family supported scientific conferences that would later feed into technological innovations. A French lineage funded arts and educational institutions that preserved Europe's cultural identity through turbulent times. An Italian dynasty created charitable foundations that supported social programs, hospitals, and research centers. These efforts were not merely acts of generosity. They were acts of preservation, a way to ensure that the world emerging from the ashes would be more stable, more civilized, more humane than the one that had destroyed itself twice in a generation. But the families also understood something subtle. The modern world mistrusted old aristocracy. Titles, crests, coats of arms, these were relics. So they changed their appearance. They became diplomats, bankers, economists, scholars. Their identities became professional rather than hereditary. Their influence flowed through institutions, not palaces. Their power was exercised through expertise, not privilege. Over time, the phrase "old noble family" became less about titles and more about legacy. The world no longer recognized them as aristocrats. Instead, it saw them as respected figures in law, finance, academia, diplomacy, or philanthropy. Their origins faded into the background, replaced by their modern roles. And this suited them perfectly. They had never sought public recognition. They sought relevance. They sought longevity. They sought a role in shaping the future that was rising, unpredictable, and full of new dangers. The Cold War added another layer to this story. As the world split into competing ideologies, influence moved into even subtler channels. Cultural diplomacy, foreign aid, intelligence agencies, and multinational banks became arenas where quiet influence mattered more than ever. Members of old European families, discreet, multilingual, historically informed, fit naturally into these roles. Their family networks gave them insight into cultures behind the Iron Curtain. Their backgrounds gave them credibility in negotiations. Their discretion made them ideal intermediaries during tense standoffs. And when the Cold War finally thawed, the world entered yet another stage, the globalized era. Once again, the families adapted. Some launched foundations that supported environmental efforts, scientific research, or human rights. Others became entrepreneurs in technology, finance, real estate, or media. Many joined international advisory councils, think tanks, or diplomatic missions. Their influence became harder to trace, more diffused, more integrated into the fabric of global society. Yet it remained present, subtle, enduring, silent as always. The most fascinating part of this transformation is not that these families maintained influence, but how they did it. Not through dominance, not through manipulation, not through conspiracies or overt power plays, but through patience, cultural capital, ethical positioning, expertise, and relationships built slowly over generations. They survived because they understood that the meaning of power changes with every era. In the medieval world, power was land. In the Renaissance, power was wealth. In the Age of Empires, power was trade. In the modern world, power was networks. And in the post-war era, power became something both fragile and profound, the ability to shape the institutions that shape society. They did not rule these institutions. They helped build them. And in doing so, they ensured that even as the world changed beyond recognition, their presence, quiet, unbroken, unseen, continued into the future. The modern world prides itself on being new technologies, new billionaires, new political movements, new social orders. Yet beneath this surface of rapid innovation lies something far older. The quiet merging of influential bloodlines, the weaving together of aristocratic legacies and modern wealth, of old symbols and new power. In this strange fusion, the elite families of Europe did not disappear. They transformed, becoming part of a global web of marriages, alliances, partnerships, and shared ambitions that stretches across continents. In earlier centuries, marriages were strategic tools, carefully crafted agreements between noble houses, designed to secure land, alliances, or political leverage. But in the modern age, the strategy changed. Land mattered less. Titles mattered little. Influence now came from capital, mobility, reputation, access, and networks that transcended national borders. And so the marriages of the modern elite became something different, the merging of old-world stability with new-world opportunity. Imagine a wedding in the early 20th century, not in a gilded palace, but in a quiet villa overlooking Lake Como. The groom belongs to a family whose lineage stretches back to the Renaissance, a name whispered for centuries in diplomatic chambers. The bride is the daughter of an American industrial magnate, wealthy, ambitious, and eager to introduce her family into the European social sphere. The newspapers describe it as a romantic union. But behind the scenes, it is something else entirely. A merging of two worlds, each offering something the other needs. Old prestige meets new wealth. Old connections meet new industries. Old influence meets new ambition. This kind of alliance becomes increasingly common as the century progresses. European noble families, faced with the decline of traditional aristocratic privileges, find themselves drawn toward the financial empires rising in America, Britain, Germany, and later Asia. They marry into banking families, media dynasties, oil fortunes, tech innovators, industrial giants. These unions are not cynical. They are natural evolutions of a world where influence crosses borders more easily than ever before. Through these marriages, children grow up with dual identities. Fluent in multiple languages, comfortable in international schools, equally at home in Paris, New York, London, Vienna, or Geneva. They inherit not just wealth but connections, countless threads stretching into diplomacy, finance, business, philanthropy, and the cultural elite. This new generation becomes the bridge between old power and new. Picture a young woman studying at Oxford whose family once advised popes and emperors. Her classmates include the heirs of global corporations, future prime ministers, children of ambassadors, and rising intellectuals. They share ideas over coffee, debate policy in lecture halls, and form friendships that will last decades. These bonds, formed in youth, become the foundations of tomorrow's influence. Or imagine a young man born into a family with a title that carries little legal power but immense cultural weight. He joins an international consultancy firm, where he works alongside economists, diplomats, and entrepreneurs. His background gives him a rare advantage. He understands history not as something written in books, but as a living force he has inherited. He moves through corporate boardrooms with the same calm ease his ancestors carried into royal courts. In the modern world, these families no longer need to operate in the shadows. They do not need to manipulate events like puppeteers. Instead, they blend into the fabric of global society, shaping it simply by being part of the networks that define influence. They sit on boards of global companies, advise international organizations, lead philanthropic foundations, and contribute to cultural institutions. Their power is softer now, less about control, more about direction. But beneath this modern sophistication lies a deeper truth. The same families who once guided thrones now guide ideas. Ideas about education, ideas about governance, ideas about environmental responsibility, ideas about economic stability, ideas about global cooperation. They sponsor scholarships that shape the careers of future leaders. They fund medical research, cultural preservation, and humanitarian efforts. They organize conferences where experts discuss the future of energy, technology, or diplomacy. In these spaces, influence is not declared, it is shared, exchanged, subtly crystallized. The merging of old and new elites also brings unexpected consequences. It dilutes the rigid hierarchy of traditional nobility, replacing it with a broader, more fluid class of influence. It introduces innovation into circles once shaped by tradition. It encourages global thinking over localized ambition. But it also raises new questions. Who holds power now? Where does influence begin or end? How much of the modern world is shaped by networks we cannot fully see? The truth is both simple and complex. Simple because nothing mystical is happening. Complex because human influence has always been complex. What exists today is not a secret order, but a constellation of families, individuals, and institutions bound together by shared education, shared wealth, shared values, shared opportunities. The noble families of Europe are not puppet masters. They are participants in an evolving ecosystem of influence that stretches from Washington to Brussels, from Silicon Valley to Dubai, from London to Singapore. This ecosystem thrives on cooperation. Power is no longer held by a single monarchy or dynasty. It is distributed across foundations, corporations, universities, diplomatic networks, media organizations, and international councils. But the families who once shaped Europe's destiny remain unusually skilled at navigating these environments. They understand subtlety. They understand timing. They understand the value of relationships. And they understand, perhaps better than anyone, that influence in the modern world flows through trust. Trust built over generations. Trust passed through marriages. Trust shared among those who hold similar hopes for stability and progress. In this sense, the Black Nobility becomes less a historical category and more a metaphor for a continuing phenomenon, the quiet endurance of families who mastered the art of influence so deeply that they evolved with every era, integrating themselves into the emerging structures of power without conflict or collapse. Not rulers of the world, but navigators of it. Not invisible tyrants, but visible participants with invisible histories. And in this modern era, as the world becomes more interconnected, more unpredictable, more fragile, these interwoven lineages, part old, part new, carry forward a tradition that has defined their families for nearly 1,000 years. The ability to adapt, to merge, to guide, and to endure. Every age creates its own myths. When people cannot fully see the structures shaping their world, they imagine what lurks behind the curtain. They fill the silence with stories, the gaps with speculation, and the unknown with shadows. And so, as the modern era unfolded, fast, disorienting, filled with new technologies and global systems, rumors about hidden families, secret councils, and ancient influence surged once again. The term Black Nobility, once a historical description, began to merge with legend. It is easy to understand why. The world became more complicated than ever before. Governments formed alliances the public barely understood. Financial markets reacted to events that seemed distant and abstract. Decisions made in one city affected millions on the other side of the world. And in this landscape of uncertainty, people reached instinctively for explanations. Simple, dramatic, compelling. Conspiracy theories filled that space. Some imagined the old noble families as puppet masters controlling every global event. Others transformed them into occult societies practicing forbidden rituals. Some claimed they manipulated presidents, popes, and prime ministers. A few insisted they were the invisible architects of every war, every financial crisis, every political shift. The theories grew in complexity, weaving together scraps of truth with webs of fantasy. A marriage alliance here, a financial investment there, a historical coincidence, a shared surname, a symbol on a building, a family crest in a museum. All these fragments were stitched together into grand narratives that had little to do with the lived reality of the families themselves. And yet, the fascination persisted. Part of this was psychological. Humans seek patterns, especially in times of uncertainty. When life feels chaotic, the mind reaches for narratives that impose meaning. If the world is shaped by a vast, coordinated force, then everything good or bad feels less random. It becomes a story rather than a storm, plan rather than chaos. Even fear becomes easier to bear when it has a face, a name, and origin. Another part of the fascination came from history itself. These families really had survived for centuries. They really had quietly influenced politics, finance, and diplomacy. Their endurance was extraordinary. Their networks were unusual. Their adaptability was almost uncanny. And these truths, combined with secrecy, tradition, and the mystique of aristocracy, created fertile ground for myths. Imagine a researcher opening an archive and finding a letter from a 16th-century cardinal to a wealthy merchant family discussing political alliances. To a historian, it is evidence of typical Renaissance diplomacy. To a conspiracy theorist, it is the blueprint of a secret world order. Or imagine an old aristocratic name appearing in the board of a modern bank. To an economist, it is simply the descendant of a wealthy lineage pursuing a career. To those hungry for mystery, it becomes proof of a controlling dynasty. In truth, the legends reveal more about society than about the families themselves. People fear what they cannot see. People invent villains when institutions feel distant. People seek simple answers to complex systems. People imagine puppeteers when bureaucracy overwhelms them. Yet the reality of influence is far more human, and far less theatrical. The old families endured because they adapted, not because they controlled. They advised because they were educated, not because they commanded. They survived upheavals by avoiding the spotlight, not by orchestrating chaos. Their power is not absolute. It is contextual. It flows through relationships, not commands. Through networks, not conspiracies. Through reputation, not domination. But myths have a life of their own. Throughout the 20th century, books, whispers, pamphlets, and later internet forums transformed the Black Nobility into an all-encompassing explanation for global inequality, political secrecy, and economic uncertainty. Sometimes these stories became sinister, sometimes fantastical, sometimes strangely poetic. They turned human families into symbols. Symbols of fear, symbols of fascination, symbols of everything people could not explain. And despite being wildly inaccurate, these myths achieved something unexpected. They revealed how deeply people distrust power when they cannot see it clearly. They exposed the anxiety underlying modern society, the feeling that decisions are made far from the public eye, that institutions are too large to comprehend, that ordinary lives are shaped by invisible forces. In this sense, the legend of the Black Nobility is not just about the families themselves. It is about us. It reflects our longing for transparency, our fear of being powerless, our suspicion of elites, our desire for stories with identifiable heroes and villains, our struggle to understand a world that has grown too vast, too fast, too interconnected. When people talk about the Black Nobility today, they are often not really talking about aristocratic bloodlines. They are talking about their own frustration with complexity, the feeling that the world is governed by forces beyond ordinary reach. The myth becomes a mirror held up to society, revealing cracks in trust, knowledge, and stability. And yet, behind these myths, behind these imagined grand designs, real history still flows, quieter, subtler, stranger than fiction. A history of families who adapted across ages, who survived because they understood the power of patience and discretion. Not gods, not puppet masters, not supernatural forces, merely humans navigating the shifting tides of influence across 1,000 years. The mythology surrounding them tells one story. The reality, still unfolding, tells another. Modern society is built on a paradox. The more connected we become, the less we understand the machinery behind the systems that shape our lives. Millions of wires, signals, markets, treaties, laws, and algorithms hum beneath the surface of daily existence. Too fast, too complex, too vast for any single person to grasp. And in this swirling storm of global institutions, old networks still move quietly, not commanding the world but navigating it, interpreting it, influencing it in ways subtle and invisible to most. These networks are not conspiracies. They are continuities, echoes of centuries-old relationships woven into the modern world. A government minister in Brussels picks up the phone and calls an old friend from university who now works in Tokyo. They speak not as officials, but as two people who trust each other. A problem is resolved before it becomes a crisis. A misunderstanding fades before it becomes a headline. No one sees the call. A philanthropist in New York hosts a private dinner. Around the table sit economists, researchers, diplomats, and the descendant of a once powerful European family. They discuss climate change, migration, and global health. No policy is drafted. No public statement is made. But ideas take shape, ideas that will later influence research grants, academic programs, and international cooperation. A young lawyer in London receives an invitation to a cultural event hosted by a historical foundation. She attends out of curiosity and finds herself surrounded by strangers who share similar values, similar education, similar unspoken ambition. Among them is a quiet family whose name she recognizes only vaguely. Yet the conversations she has that night will guide her career for decades. These interactions, small and unremarkable at first glance, are the threads that form the invisible web of influence in the modern world. Not dark or sinister, but organic, born from trust, from shared history, from the instinct humans have to cluster in circles that offer security and potential. And yet, to the public watching from afar, these subtle connections feel mysterious, opaque, unreachable. People see world leaders shaking hands at summits and assume these are the true moments of diplomacy. They see CEOs releasing statements and assume these are the real decisions. They see parliaments voting and assume this is where power lives. But behind each visible moment lie dozens of invisible ones. Conversations, friendships, negotiations, signals, favors, warnings, reassurances. These are not secret orders plotting world domination. They are the natural, undeniable reality of human networks operating at high levels. Throughout history, the elite have always communicated in ways the public does not witness. In medieval courts, it happened through whispered conversations behind tapestries. In the Renaissance, it happened in candlelit salons. In the Age of Empires, it happened in private correspondence. And today, it happens in closed-door conferences, encrypted messages, academic gatherings, charity boards, and select professional circles. This is not the realm of fantasy but of sociology. Power moves through proximity. Influence travels through relationships. Decisions crystallize where trust is highest. And because many of the old families, those descendants of Venetian merchants, Roman aristocrats, Austrian diplomats, spent centuries cultivating trust, they remain quietly present in these spaces. Not as rulers, as facilitators, not as controllers, as connectors. Consider a scientific conference in Geneva. Researchers from dozens of countries attend, presenting breakthroughs and debating theories. Amid them sits an elderly man whose family once advised European monarchs. He is no scientist, yet he funds several research institutions. His questions steer discussion. His foundations grant support certain fields over others. His attendance alone attracts journalists, benefactors, and policymakers. He is not shaping science with orders, he is shaping it with gravity. Or picture a gathering of economic advisors in Davos. Executives speak of innovation and risk. Politicians speak of reform and regulation. Academics speak of data and projections. In the quiet spaces between panels, conversations unfold. Small agreements, mutual understandings, future collaborations. Among these figures are individuals whose family roots stretch back centuries. Their voices do not dominate. They anchor. They offer long-term perspective in a world obsessed with the quarter-year and election cycle. The irony of the modern age is that while institutions have become global, human behavior has not changed. People still follow familiar patterns. Trust those they know, listen to those they respect, rely on those with consistent reputations. And the old families, having built reputations over generations, still embody consistency in a world that changes too quickly for most to keep up. But there is another reason they remain influential. They are not frightened by uncertainty. Where modern elites panic in the face of crisis, financial crashes, political upheaval, technological disruption, the old families respond with the practiced calm of those who have survived the fall of empires, the collapse of currencies, the death of thrones. History has trained them. Adaptation is inherited. Crisis management is cultural. They do not fear chaos. They understand it. This makes them valuable in moments when governments falter, when markets fall, when institutions struggle. They provide continuity where none exists, not because they are superhuman, but because their families have been through variations of these crises many times before. To the public, this looks like mystique. To those who know them, it looks like experience. And yet, even with their quiet presence woven into modern influence, the families themselves face a transformation unlike any before. The world accelerates faster than tradition can keep up. Technology disrupts old patterns of power. Social media exposes, amplifies, distorts. Transparency is demanded from institutions that were never built for visibility. The old families find themselves balancing legacy with adaptation. Some embrace the new world fully. Others withdraw. Many walk a narrow line between tradition and innovation. But regardless of their path, they remain part of the world's invisible architecture. Not through domination, but through participation. They are pieces of a vast puzzle, threads in a global tapestry that includes diplomats, scientists, activists, investors, journalists, and ordinary citizens whose actions ripple outward in unexpected ways. Modern influence is not a pyramid. It is a constellation, and the families once called the Black Nobility are stars whose light has dimmed in visibility but not in persistence. They are not the authors of every event, nor the conductors of a secret symphony. They are simply part of the quiet background, an inheritance of perspective, presence, and patience that continues to echo through the networked world. The truth is far less fantastical than legend, and far more intricate. There comes a moment in every era when the past threatens to disappear, not through destruction but through forgetting. Old archives gather dust. Stories once whispered in palaces fade into silence. Names carved into stone become little more than decorative curiosities. And yet, just as history seems ready to bury certain legacies, something unexpected happens. The present turns back to look at the shadows. It asks questions. It digs. It wonders. And in that act of curiosity, the past begins to breathe again. This is the strange revival of the so-called Black Nobility, not in power, but in memory. In the 21st century, the world is obsessed with transparency. People demand to know who influences governments, who funds major institutions, who controls corporations, who shapes global narratives. In a time when almost everything is documented, tracked, digitized, and exposed, the very idea of old families with subtle influence feels both suspicious and intriguing. The phrase Black Nobility reemerges in the public imagination not because these families are orchestrating world events, but because their invisibility stands out in an age where visibility is everything. Modern society struggles to understand forces that remain quiet, so it fills the silence with stories. The internet, especially, has become a kind of global campfire around which myths are retold, reshaped, and recharged. Forums, videos, podcasts, and late-night comment threads revive fragments of history, pulling Venetian merchants, Roman aristocrats, and German nobles into wild narratives about secret councils and clandestine networks. It becomes a patchwork of facts and fantasies stitched together by a desire for clarity in a world that feels increasingly opaque. Imagine a young researcher in London scrolling through online archives at midnight. He stumbles on a footnote in a 19th-century text referencing a black aristocracy. Curious, he starts connecting unrelated dots. Marriage records here, financial investments there, a crest on a building, a familiar surname in a modern corporation. Before he realizes it, he has constructed an elaborate theory, thrilling but inaccurate. He shares it online. Within weeks, thousands have read it. Some believe it, some question it, some embellish it, and a new branch of myth grows. This phenomenon is not unique to these families. It is part of a much larger pattern. A collective longing to understand how power works in a world that feels too complicated to grasp. People want simplicity, a narrative with clear villains and hidden architects. The truth that power today is fragmented, chaotic, distributed among countless institutions, feels less satisfying than a story with ancient roots and shadowy continuity. And so, the revival of the Black Nobility becomes a cultural symbol, not of domination, but of the anxiety woven through modern society. Yet behind all the speculation, behind the distorted narratives and historical misunderstandings, something genuine remains. These families do still exist. Their names, though often changed or assimilated, appear in cultural foundations, academic institutions, diplomatic circles, and discrete philanthropic networks. They are not omnipotent. They are not orchestrating global events. But they are present, as part of the continuum of history that refuses to fully dissolve. Some descendants maintain ancient villas in Italy or Austria, hosting world-class conferences on heritage conservation. Others work in international law, shaped by a family tradition of diplomacy. Some are artists or historians, determined to preserve Europe's cultural legacy. A few pursue quiet political careers, respected not for their titles but for their education and conduct. What is striking is not their power, but their persistence. They survived by blending in. Their influence survived by evolving. And their story survived because the public, consciously or not, senses that history is never as distant as it seems. Imagine a candlelit dinner in Rome in a 500-year-old palazzo. The guests include musicians, scholars, a diplomat, an architect, and the descendant of a once powerful family who now works as a cultural advisor. They speak not of control, but of preservation. How to protect historical sites, how to sustain art in an age of distraction, how to maintain Europe's identity in a rapidly globalizing world. Outside, scooters roar through the night and crowds move beneath neon lights, unaware that inside the palazzo a thread of the past is being tended like a fragile flame. Or imagine a quiet library in Vienna where a young woman studies her family's archives. She is preparing a museum exhibition, not a political strategy. The letters she reads belong to ancestors who lived through the fall of empires, the rise of nationalism, world wars, and global reconstruction. Their handwriting is elegant, their concerns both timeless and alien. She feels connected to them, not as a guardian of secret power, but as the carrier of a story that stretches far beyond her lifetime. These scenes are far from the myths that swirl around the term Black Nobility. But perhaps they are more interesting because they are real. The revival of interest in these families reveals something important. Modern society hungers for continuity. In a world of fast news cycles, fleeting trends, and fragile institutions, the idea of a lineage that stretches across centuries feels both mysterious and grounding. It offers perspective. It reminds us that humanity has endured far worse chaos than our own era. It pushes us to think in longer timelines, beyond election cycles and quarterly reports. And yet, this revival is not without tension. Some descendants feel burdened by the myths surrounding their names. Others feel protective of their history. Many choose privacy, aware that public scrutiny often distorts more than it reveals. A few embrace transparency, publishing family archives and engaging with historians to dismantle misinformation. But in the end, the revival is not about the families themselves. It is about the void they occupy, an empty space in public understanding into which imagination rushes. The modern world is vast, interconnected, and bewildering. Power today is more complex than at any point in history. It is institutional, financial, corporate, political, cultural, digital. There is no single throne, no single dynasty, no single hidden order pulling every string. There are only networks, overlapping, shifting, fragile, sometimes ancient, sometimes new. And the old families, the so-called Black Nobility, remain inside these networks not as masterminds, but as memories made flesh. They represent continuity in a world afraid of collapse, mystery in a world addicted to explanation, and history in a world that often forgets its own past. Perhaps that is why they fascinate us. Not because they rule the world, but because they remind us that the world was not born yesterday. If you look closely at the modern world, past the noise of headlines, past the glare of political theater, past the endless flow of data, you begin to notice something strange. Power still moves, but not in straight lines. Influence still flows, but not through obvious channels. Decisions are still shaped by individuals, yet rarely by those standing at podiums or appearing on television screens. Instead, influence hums quietly through places the public seldom sees. Think tanks, cultural councils, diplomatic retreats, philanthropic foundations, academic committees, private forums. In these subtle arenas, the echoes of old families still appear, but not as rulers. As interpreters, the world systems have grown too vast for any one group to control. Governments wrestle with global crises. Corporations shape markets at speeds no parliament can match. Media platforms transform public opinion with an algorithmic flick. Intelligence agencies analyze threats that shift hourly. And amid this constant flux, there exists a need for something very old-fashioned: continuity, perspective, a long memory, a steady hand that understands not just what is happening now, but what has happened before and what may happen again. This is where the old families quietly step in, not as puppet masters, as caretakers of context. Imagine a closed-door forum hosted at an alpine retreat. Snow falls silently outside, muffling the world. Inside, a group of international leaders debates the future of technological ethics. Among the attendees is a historian from a family whose archives stretch back a millennium. He speaks not as an aristocrat, but as a scholar. He reminds the room that societies have faced moral crossroads before, during the printing revolution, during the rise of industrial machinery, during the birth of global trade. He does not dictate policy, but his perspective shifts the tone. Suddenly, the conversation broadens. Fear gives way to understanding. Reaction becomes reflection. Or imagine a philanthropic roundtable in New York. Wealthy donors discuss funding for global education. A woman with a familiar European surname sits quietly at the edge of the table. Her family once advised kings. Now she advises on curriculum development. Her voice is soft, but when she mentions the collapse of empires caused by educational inequality, a fact she knows from personal family documents, everyone listens. Decisions change. Funding shifts. Not because she wields power, but because she carries history. This is the reality of modern influence. Subtle, indirect, relational. Far from the conspiratorial fantasies, the descendants of old families have become specialists in preserving perspective in systems that move too fast and forget too quickly. Their contribution is not authority. It is memory. They help institutions understand the long arc of human behavior, how societies rise and fall, how corruption grows and recedes, how culture strengthens or weakens a nation, how diplomacy fails or succeeds. And because these families have lived through so many eras, they possess something rare. An instinct for long-term thinking in a world addicted to immediacy. But this role also creates an illusion. From the outside, their presence looks like hidden influence. To someone searching for villains or shadow councils, a single familiar name on the board of an international charity seems like a clue. A noble crest in a university gallery looks like a symbol. A family donation to a global organization looks like covert funding. In truth, it is continuity mistaken for conspiracy. The world today is shaped by countless hands. Scientists, engineers, activists, entrepreneurs, politicians, media creators, economists, educators. No single group controls the narrative. But those who can move between these worlds, who can speak the languages of diplomacy, finance, culture, and scholarship, become bridges. And the old families excel at becoming bridges. They have learned to navigate complexity. They have learned to observe before acting. They have learned to influence not through force, but through relationships built on decades, sometimes centuries, of trust. In a world where alliances shift overnight, their slow, steady approach becomes valuable. They are often the ones who can call a diplomat in a moment of crisis, who can reach across ideological divides, who can remind leaders of lessons buried in the past. But this is not destiny. It is training. A young member of one such family grows up surrounded not by political secrets, but by books, languages, travel, mentorship. She is taught to see culture as a living thing, to understand that stability is fragile, that power is temporary, that influence must be used carefully. She studies international relations not because her family tells her to, but because she feels drawn to it. When she joins a global organization years later, she brings with her not the arrogance of inherited privilege, but the humility of inherited responsibility. The modern world rarely acknowledges such nuance. Its hunger for clear narratives, heroes or villains, transparency or corruption, has little patience for quiet, ambiguous roles. And so rumors persist, myths grow. The phrase Black Nobility becomes detached from history and repurposed into something cinematic. But beneath the myth, the truth is far more grounded. These families help interpret the modern world because they have lived through so many versions of it. Their influence today is less about power and more about translation, between cultures, systems, generations, and histories. They are not architects of global events, but interpreters of global complexity. They hold not the levers of power, but the threads of continuity. And in a world as fractured as ours, continuity can feel like a kind of magic. Imagine a moment decades from now. The world faces a crisis no one predicted. Institutions falter. Leaders scramble. Amid the noise, a small group of experts, scientists, diplomats, economists, gather behind closed doors. Among them sits someone whose family has seen the world break before. She speaks slowly, carefully, reminding them of the patterns humans repeat. Her words are not commands. They are anchors. History does not repeat itself, but it echoes. And those who have listened to those echoes for centuries become vital in moments when the future trembles. Some truths do not announce themselves with thunder. They arrive quietly, like a soft shift in the air, like the way light changes just before dawn. And somewhere between myth and history, between suspicion and reality, between the visible world and the hidden foundations beneath it, lies the truth about influence, how it moves, how it survives, and how ordinary people can sense it without ever truly seeing it. We like to imagine the past as distant and sealed away. Yet the truth is far more intimate. The past breathes through the present. Every institution, every law, every alliance carries echoes of decisions made long before any of us were born. And when people look at the complexity of the modern world, when they sense patterns they cannot explain, when they feel the presence of forces they cannot define, their minds reach for stories. Stories of hidden families, ancient orders, shadow networks that persist beyond reason. But perhaps the real story is subtler, stranger, and more human than any myth. Walk into an old European library. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, shelves lined with manuscripts whose pages have yellowed over centuries. Somewhere in this room lies a record of a decision made in 1620 that influences a modern border. A contract from 1714 that still shapes a bank's inner workings. A diplomatic letter from 1782 that echoes in today's alliances. History doesn't vanish. It accumulates. It layers itself beneath our feet. In this sense, the families who lived through these centuries are not ghosts haunting the modern world. They are memories with descendants. Their influence survives not because they command the world, but because they remember how the world once was. And memory, when used wisely, becomes a quiet force of stability. Yet the perception of invisible influence persists, especially in an age where the visible world feels overwhelming. People look at economic crises, sudden political shifts, global agreements, technological leaps, and they wonder, how can all of this be happening? Who is truly in control? And when they find no clear answers, their minds drift back to the shadows. In a way, the shadows are comforting. They offer clarity where reality offers chaos. They offer villains where reality offers systems. They offer narrative where reality offers noise. They offer intention where reality offers accident. But the truth about influence, real influence, is that it never looks like a puppet master pulling strings. It looks like a whisper carried across generations. It looks like a tradition of careful thinking passed from parent to child. It looks like 1,000 years of learned restraint. It looks like people who understand that power is fragile and must be wielded as lightly as breath. Imagine a modern diplomat sitting alone before a crucial negotiation. The fate of a region hangs in the balance. Pressures mount from all sides. His phone buzzes. A short message from someone whose family has known his family for decades. Not instructions, just reassurance. A reminder of a historical lesson gleaned from archives few people ever read. Suddenly, the diplomat sees the bigger picture. His posture calms. His decisions shift. Not because he is controlled, but because experience borrowed through trust has steadied him. That is what influence looks like in the modern world. Not commands. Connections. Not secrecy. Continuity. Not domination. Memory. The families who embody this continuity do not appear on talk shows or magazine covers. They do not seek fame. Fame is noisy, unstable, and short-lived. They remain in the background because that is where perspective survives best. Their presence is felt not through power grabs, but through the gravitational pull of long-standing relationships, cross-generational friendships, shared values forged through centuries of survival. And yet, even this understated influence faces a new challenge, one no previous generation ever encountered. The age of information, an age where transparency is demanded, where every detail can be photographed, leaked, exposed, debated, distorted. An age where nuance is often crushed beneath sensationalism, where complexity is replaced with simplified narratives, where history is overshadowed by viral stories that travel faster than truth. In such a world, the mere existence of long-standing families becomes a magnet for speculation. Their privacy becomes a canvas onto which society projects its anxieties. Their lineage becomes a symbol, sometimes admired, sometimes resented, often misunderstood. And so they walk a delicate line. If they retreat completely, myths expand in the silence. If they reveal too much, they lose the very privacy that once safeguarded their survival. If they engage with the world openly, they risk being misinterpreted. If they disengage, they risk irrelevance. Most choose a middle path, participation without spectacle, influence without exposure, contribution without branding. They appear where needed, withdraw where appropriate, and move through the world with an awareness of how fragile and volatile modern narratives can be. What is most fascinating is how ordinary many of their lives are now. A descendant of a centuries-old lineage works as a lawyer handling environmental policy. Another becomes a filmmaker. Another teaches history. Another runs a small charity. Their surnames carry whispers of ancient stories, but their daily lives reflect the same challenges, hopes, fears, and dreams shared by millions around them. Yet something remains, an inherited sense of perspective, a calmness in crises, a habit of thinking in decades instead of days. These traits, passed quietly from one era to the next, are what modern institutions sometimes lean on in turbulent times. Not power, not money, but perspective. And maybe, in a world that often feels like it is accelerating too fast, that perspective matters more than it ever did before. The shadows people fear are not as dark as imagined. The networks people suspect are not as coordinated as believed. The influence people sense is not manipulation but memory. And the families people mythologize are not specters controlling society. They are simply the remnants of a long, complex history still trying, in their own quiet ways, to understand the world alongside everyone else. The deeper we travel into the corridors of history, the more we realize that influence has never been a thunderclap. It has always been a whisper, not a force that commands, but a presence that endures. As centuries shift and empires crumble, something remains in the shadows, quiet, steady, unbroken. Not a conspiracy, a memory. For generations, people have imagined that unseen families shape the world from the dark. But the truth, revealed slowly across time, is far gentler. Influence is not a hand pulling strings. It is a long awareness, carried like a lantern through storms. Some families simply lived long enough, endured enough, learned enough to recognize patterns most others overlook. Picture an old villa in Italy, where a man reads the diary of an ancestor who lived through wars now forgotten. Picture a young woman in New York, carrying a sense of history she never asked for but cannot deny. Picture a diplomat who steadies himself with a message from an old friend whose lineage stretches back centuries. These moments do not shape the world, but they shape decisions. And decisions become history. Perhaps the fascination with Black Nobility persists not because these families control the world, but because the world longs for someone who understands it. Someone who remembers the story we are still writing. And in that longing, myth and truth blur into something oddly human. The real secret is simple. Influence fades. Titles fade. Myths fade. But memory endures. At the edge of history and myth, the truth softens. The Black Nobility legend survives not because these families secretly rule the world, but because people long for something ancient in an age that feels unstable. When life becomes confusing, the idea of old lineages carrying hidden wisdom feels comforting. Picture a quiet courtyard in Rome where scholars talk about culture, not power. A reunion in Tuscany where elders tell centuries-old stories that help the younger generation feel grounded. A student in Berlin reading old merchant letters, discovering not conspiracies, just lessons about survival. The myth persists because it fills a void. It simplifies a world that feels too complex. It gives shape to fears we cannot name. But the truth underneath is humble. Continuity is not control. It is simply the endurance of memory in a world that forgets too easily. And now the story slows. Cities glow beneath the night sky, each light a life unfolding. After all the whispers and legends, what remains is not a hidden empire, just continuity. The families once imagined as shadow rulers were never masters of destiny. They were witnesses to it, carrying fragments of history the world often forgets. Imagine an old man reading a letter from a long-gone ancestor, or a young woman in Paris shaped quietly by her heritage. These are not scenes of power, they are scenes of remembrance. History doesn't endure because someone controls it. History endures because someone remembers it. As the final image fades, an old crest appears, worn, softened, surviving. Not a symbol of dominance, but of time itself. Some shadows do not hide power. They protect memory.